Hey guys, tonight we begin an extraordinary journey through the darkest secrets of royal history. Secrets so shocking, they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about power and glamour. What if I told you that Queen Elizabeth I, one of history's most celebrated monarchs, knowingly painted her face with the substance she knew was slowly killing her? Picture this. Every single morning for decades, she allowed her servants to coat her skin with white lead mixed with vinegar, a deadly poison that was literally eating her alive from the outside in. And the most chilling part, she wasn't some naive victim. She knew exactly what it was doing to her. But here's what will really blow your mind. Elizabeth wasn't alone in this madness. Tonight, I'm going to share 5 royal beauty secrets so twisted, so dangerous, and so absolutely insane that they make today's most extreme beauty trends look like child's play. We're talking about queens who wore jewelry made from dead people's hair, kings who went their entire lives without bathing, and beauty treatments involving actual animal waste. These aren't just quirky historical footnotes. These are stories that will fundamentally change how you see power, vanity, and the lengths people will go to maintain an image. By the end of tonight's story, you'll never look at a royal portrait the same way again. Before we dive into these mind-blowing secrets together, I genuinely love your support. If this story hooks you the way I think it will, smash that subscribe button and hit like. And here's something I'm really curious about. Are you someone who loves falling asleep to historical mysteries? Or maybe you're wide awake, fascinated by the dark side of power? Drop a comment and tell me what draws you to these royal secrets. I read every single comment, and your stories about why you love these tales genuinely make my day. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for beauty rituals that were literally to die for. Let me paint you a picture that will haunt you. It's a cold morning in 1588 at Greenwich Palace. Queen Elizabeth I, at 55 years old, sits before an ornate Venetian mirror. Her reflection shows a face ravaged by decades of smallpox scars, craters and pits that remind her daily of her own mortality. In an age where queens were supposed to be chosen by God himself, looking human was political suicide. So what does she do? She chooses actual suicide instead, just the slow, agonizing kind. Her servants approach with brushes and a mixture called Venetian ceruse, white lead ground with vinegar. Elizabeth extends her face toward them, knowing full well that this beautiful white powder is pure poison. Court physicians have warned her repeatedly. She's watched other noblewomen develop violent tremors, lose chunks of their hair, and waste away into skeletal versions of themselves. But she doesn't care, because when that toxic mask covers her scars, something magical happens. The lead paint creates an otherworldly porcelain finish that makes her look almost supernatural. Courtiers literally described her as appearing like a living marble statue untouchable by time itself. Here's the heartbreaking irony. The more the poison damaged her skin, the more she needed it. As the lead ate away at her face, creating new scarring and discoloration, Elizabeth applied it thicker and thicker, desperately chasing an illusion of eternal youth. By her final years, witnesses reported that her makeup was so thick it would actually crack when she smiled, revealing the devastated flesh beneath. Imagine the horror of watching your own face literally fall apart every time you express joy. But wait, can you guess what's even more disturbing than knowingly poisoning yourself for beauty, using dead people as fashion accessories? When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria didn't just mourn, she turned grief into the most macabre fashion statement in royal history. Victoria commissioned jewellery makers to weave elaborate necklaces, brooches and rings entirely from Albert's hair. Not just a simple locket with a strand inside, we're talking full pieces of jewellery made from her dead husband's body. She wore these pieces every single day for the rest of her 40-year life. Essentially, she spent 4 decades wearing parts of a corpse as accessories. The Victorian hair jewellery industry absolutely exploded because of the Queen's obsession. Entire workshops opened dedicated to weaving human hair into intricate designs. Catalogues advertised mourning jewellery with the same enthusiasm as modern jewellery stores advertise diamonds. But here's where Victoria's grief became truly disturbing. She didn't stop with Albert's hair. She began collecting hair from every deceased relative, friend, and even beloved pets. Her jewellery collection became what was essentially a wearable cemetery. Imagine meeting Queen Victoria at a state dinner, complimenting her beautiful necklace, and having her cheerfully respond, "Oh, thank you. It's made from my dead uncle's hair." Can you picture walking into a Tiffany & Co. today and asking for a bracelet made from your grandmother's hair? You'd be escorted out by security and probably put on some kind of watch list. Now, if wearing dead people seems extreme, you're going to be absolutely floored by what French royalty considered sophisticated hygiene. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe, living in the most luxurious palace ever constructed, allegedly bathed only twice in his entire 77-year lifetime. Twice. That's fewer baths than most people take in a single week. But here's the kicker. This wasn't due to poverty or lack of resources. The French court genuinely believed that water opened your pores and made you vulnerable to deadly diseases. So instead of bathing, they masked their body odor with increasingly elaborate perfumes and powders. The result? Versailles, despite being the most beautiful palace in the world, reportedly smelled like a giant ornate toilet. Foreign diplomats wrote detailed accounts describing the overwhelming stench that hung over what was supposed to be the pinnacle of human civilization. But wait, it gets so much worse. This became a twisted status symbol. The more you stank, the more authentically French you were considered. Clean foreign visitors were actually mocked as primitive and unsophisticated. Picture this absurd reality. Diplomatic meetings where the most powerful people in Europe are negotiating world-changing treaties while trying not to vomit from each other's body odor. Some French nobles went literal years without any water touching their skin. They'd change their linen undergarments frequently, believing that clean clothes could somehow magically absorb filth without actually cleaning their bodies. It's like thinking you can clean a car by just changing the air freshener. Speaking of French insanity, let's talk about Marie Antoinette's hair and the living creatures that called it home. You've probably seen those towering elaborate hairstyles in paintings. But what you definitely don't know is that these 3-foot-tall architectural marvels often contained live animals. We're talking actual small birds, trapped in tiny wire cages, nested within her hair as decorations. The most famous was her pouf à l'inoculation, a hairstyle celebrating smallpox inoculation that featured a miniature medical scene built into her hair, complete with tiny figures and working instruments. Imagine attending a dinner party today with a miniature surgery diorama on your head. But the birds were the real nightmare. These weren't stuffed decorations. They were living creatures that would sometimes die during long court events. The Duchess of Devonshire once had a dove die in her hair during a formal dinner and had to continue socializing for hours with a rotting bird on her head, because leaving early would have been considered unforgivably rude. Think about the logistics alone. These hairstyles took so long to construct that women would sleep sitting upright for weeks to preserve them. They'd develop severe neck problems, scalp infections, and sometimes serious infestations when the organic materials began decomposing directly on their heads. But if you think French hair fashion was extreme, ancient Egyptian royal skincare will absolutely blow your mind. Cleopatra, legendary for her beauty, didn't just bathe in milk and honey like romantic stories suggest. Archaeological evidence shows that Egyptian royalty regularly applied crocodile dung to their faces as an anti-aging treatment. Yes, you heard that correctly. Crocodile excrement mixed with honey and oils smeared directly onto their skin as a beauty mask. But it gets worse. They also used mixtures containing mouse droppings, ostrich eggs, and fat from various exotic animals. The Egyptian logic? The more rare and exotic the ingredient, the more powerful its beautifying properties. So queens would literally coat themselves with a cocktail of animal waste and claim it was the secret to eternal youth. Here's the mind-bending irony. Some of these disgusting treatments might have actually worked, but for completely different reasons than they imagined. Crocodile dung contains high levels of salicylic acid, which is actually used in modern acne treatments. So while their application method was absolutely revolting, there might have been accidental scientific basis to their madness. But here's what really gets me about all these stories. These weren't desperate choices made by powerless people. These were decisions made by the most influential, educated, wealthy individuals in human history. They had access to the finest physicians, unlimited resources, the best of everything, and they chose to poison themselves, avoid basic hygiene, and smear animal waste on their faces. Can you imagine having infinite power and wealth, and using it to slowly kill yourself in the name of beauty? What's truly chilling is realizing that these beauty standards weren't just personal choices, they were political weapons. Elizabeth's lead makeup made her appear supernatural, reinforcing her divine right to rule. Victoria's mourning jewellery garnered public sympathy and political support. French elaborate hairstyles displayed wealth and reinforced social hierarchies. But every single one of these practices caused real, documented physical and psychological damage to the people who are supposed to be at the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. As I think about these stories, I can't help wondering, what beauty and status standards of our own time will future generations look back on with the same horror and disbelief? What are we doing to ourselves right now that will seem completely insane to people looking back from 2124? The beauty rituals were just the tip of the iceberg when it came to royal madness. Next, we're diving into something that will make your stomach turn. The eating habits of kings and queens that were so grotesque, so excessive, and so bizarre that they make the most extreme eating challenges look like elegant, fine dining. We're talking about royal breakfast menus that included flamingo tongues, peacock brains, and meals so extravagant they could have fed entire villages. Trust me, after you hear what Henry VIII considered a light snack, you'll never complain about your food again. Now, if you thought royal beauty rituals were disturbing, wait until you discover what these monarchs considered a normal meal. I'm about to share 4 royal eating habits so grotesque, so excessive, and so absolutely revolting that they'll make Fear Factor look like a cooking show for children. Picture this. You're sitting down for breakfast and someone serves you a plate containing 5,000 calories worth of food. That's not a typo. 5,000 calories for one meal. That was just Henry VIII's typical breakfast. But here's the part that will make your skin crawl. It wasn't just the quantity that was insane. It was what he was actually eating. Are you ready for this? Because I'm about to tell you about royal dining habits that are so stomach-churning, you might want to put down whatever snack you're enjoying right now. Let's start with Henry VIII, because his eating habits were legendary. And I mean that in the most horrifying way possible. Historical records from Hampton Court Palace show that Henry consumed between 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day. To put that in perspective, that's more than double what a modern bodybuilder eats during intense training. But it wasn't just the amount. It was the sheer madness of what constituted a royal meal. A typical dinner for Henry might include an entire roasted peacock, stuffed with smaller birds, which were themselves stuffed with even smaller birds. We're talking about a grotesque nesting doll of dead animals all served on a single plate. Here's where it gets really disturbing. Henry employed professional food tasters whose only job was to sample every single dish before it reached the king's mouth. Not because he was worried about poison, but because he was so paranoid about food quality that he needed multiple people to confirm each bite was perfect. These food tasters lived in constant terror, not just of accidental poisoning, but of Henry's rage if they detected even the slightest imperfection. Imagine having a job where your daily responsibility is eating potentially deadly food for someone else's pleasure, knowing that if you displease them, you might literally lose your head. But Henry's eating habits seem almost reasonable compared to what Roman emperors considered fine dining. Caligula, the emperor who allegedly made his horse a consul, hosted dinner parties that redefined the concept of excess. We're talking about banquets where the appetizers alone cost more than most people's annual income. But the real madness wasn't the expense, it was the menu. Roman historical accounts describe Caligula serving his guests flamingo tongues as a delicacy. Not flamingo meat, just the tongues. Do you realize how many flamingos had to die just to provide tongue appetizers for a single dinner party? Historians estimate that some of Caligula's banquets required killing hundreds of exotic birds just for a few bites of delicate meat. But flamingo tongues were just the beginning. The pièce de résistance was often peacock brains, served while still warm, directly from the skull. Guests would literally crack open peacock heads at the dinner table and scoop out the brains with tiny silver spoons. Can you imagine being invited to a dinner party today where the host cheerfully announces, "Tonight's special is fresh flamingo tongue with a side of warm peacock brain"? You'd assume you'd accidentally walked into a horror movie. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. These weren't desperate survival meals during times of famine. These were voluntary choices made by people with unlimited access to normal, delicious food. They could have eaten anything in the known world, and they chose the most bizarre, exotic, and frankly disgusting options possible. But if you think Roman excess was extreme, medieval royal drinking habits will absolutely blow your mind. Kings and queens of medieval Europe didn't just drink wine, they drank wine mixed with actual gold flakes. Not gold-coloured substances, real gold, ground into tiny particles and stirred into their drinks. They genuinely believed that consuming gold would make them immortal and cure any disease. The irony is mind-boggling. These monarchs were literally drinking the very wealth that their subjects died trying to earn. A single goblet of gold-infused wine cost more than most peasants saw in their entire lifetimes. But here's the most insane part. Gold is completely inert in the human digestive system. It passes right through without being absorbed. So these kings were essentially consuming incredibly expensive, tasteless glitter that provided absolutely zero benefit while their kingdom struggled with poverty and famine. King Louis XIV of France took royal eating disorders to an entirely different level of madness. Historical records show that for the final years of his life, Louis refused to eat any solid food whatsoever. He survived entirely on milk and liquid broths, convinced that solid food was somehow poisoning him. But this wasn't a medical condition. This was pure paranoia taken to its logical extreme. Louis became so terrified of assassination through poisoned food that he eliminated all food entirely. He employed wet nurses, grown women whose job was to provide fresh milk for a fully grown king. Picture the absolute absurdity. One of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, surrounded by the finest chefs in the world, living exclusively on milk like a newborn baby because he was too paranoid to chew. The really tragic part. Louis's liquid-only diet probably contributed to his death. Historical accounts describe him becoming increasingly weak, developing severe nutritional deficiencies, and eventually dying from what modern doctors would recognize as malnutrition. all while living in a palace filled with the most abundant food supplies in Europe. But perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of royal eating habits was the sheer waste involved. While common people literally starved to death outside palace walls, royals would host banquets where more food was thrown away than consumed. Medieval records from Versailles show that royal dinner parties regularly featured over 100 different dishes, most of which were barely touched. The food wasn't meant to be eaten, it was meant to display wealth and power. Imagine spending a fortune on an elaborate meal, just to let it rot as a status symbol while people outside your gates died of hunger. Here's what really gets me about these stories. These weren't just personal quirks or harmless eccentricities. These eating habits had real political and social consequences. When monarchs spent kingdom treasuries on flamingo tongues and gold-infused wine, that money wasn't available for infrastructure, military defense, or helping their subjects during famines. The French Revolution didn't happen in a vacuum. When starving peasants heard stories about Marie Antoinette's elaborate banquets, while they couldn't afford bread, that rage built into revolutionary fury. Royal excess literally toppled governments and cost monarchs their heads. But here's the most chilling realization. These eating habits reveal something fundamental about absolute power. When you have unlimited resources and no accountability, normal human limits simply disappear. The same mindset that led Henry to consume 5,000 calories per meal is the same mindset that led to the most devastating political decisions in history. Think about it. If someone can convince themselves that drinking gold will make them immortal, what other obviously terrible decisions might they make when running a country? If a king is too paranoid to eat solid food, how paranoid might he be about foreign diplomacy or domestic policy? These weren't just weird personal habits. They were symptoms of minds completely disconnected from reality, making life and death decisions for millions of people. As disturbing as royal eating habits were, they pale in comparison to what we're about to explore next. Because if you think consuming flamingo tongues is extreme, wait until you hear about the marriage scandals that literally rewrote world history. We're talking about royal love affairs so explosive, so politically devastating, that they created new religions, toppled dynasties, and changed the course of civilization itself. The next story involves a king who was so obsessed with one woman that he was willing to break from a 1,000-year-old church, risk civil war, and destroy international alliances, all for love. Or was it really love at all? What happens when the most powerful person on earth becomes completely obsessed with someone they can't have? Throughout history, royal love affairs have toppled governments, rewritten religious doctrine, and literally changed the map of the world. But these weren't just romantic scandals. They were acts of passion so destructive that they make modern celebrity breakups look like minor disagreements. I'm about to tell you 3 royal marriage scandals that are so explosive, so politically devastating, that they created new religions, sparked wars, and destroyed 1,000-year-old dynasties. These are stories of monarchs who chose love over logic, desire over duty, and personal happiness over the welfare of entire nations. The first story begins in 1527, when King Henry VIII made a decision that would literally split Christianity in half, all because he was desperately infatuated with a woman who refused to become his mistress. Here's what most people don't understand about Henry and Anne Boleyn. This wasn't just a king wanting a divorce. This was a complete psychological obsession that consumed the most powerful monarch in Europe for over 6 years. Henry wrote Anne 17 love letters that still exist today, and reading them is like glimpsing into the mind of someone having a complete mental breakdown. In one letter, Henry writes, "I beseech you earnestly to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us two." But here's the really disturbing part. Anne wasn't even responding to most of these letters. Henry was essentially stalking a woman who was playing incredibly hard to get, and he had the power to reshape reality to get what he wanted. Think about the sheer insanity of what Henry did. He broke England away from the Catholic Church, a religious institution that had dominated European politics for over 1,000 years. He risked excommunication, civil war, and invasion by Catholic powers. He destroyed monasteries, executed loyal advisors, and turned his entire kingdom upside down, all because one woman refused to sleep with him unless he married her. But here's the most mind-blowing part. Once Henry finally got what he wanted and married Anne Boleyn, the obsession completely evaporated. Within 3 years, he was so bored with her that he had her executed on fabricated charges of adultery. The woman he literally changed world history to marry, he murdered because he'd moved on to someone else. Can you imagine being so consumed by desire that you create an entirely new religion, then being so fickle that you kill the object of your obsession just 3 years later? It's like burning down your house to catch a butterfly, then swatting the butterfly because you're tired of looking at it. The political consequences were absolutely staggering. Henry's break with Rome led to centuries of religious warfare, the persecution of Catholics in England, and conflicts that are still affecting politics today. Millions of people died in religious wars that can be traced directly back to Henry's inability to control his romantic impulses. But if Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn reshaped religion, Catherine the Great's approach to love and marriage was so strategically calculated, it makes modern political marriages look genuinely romantic. Catherine didn't just have lovers. She had a systematic approach to romance that was essentially a form of political warfare. Historical records document at least 12 official lovers, but the real number was probably much higher. But here's what makes Catherine's story so fascinating. She wasn't driven by passion or emotion. She was using romance as a tool of statecraft. Each of Catherine's relationships served a specific political purpose. When she needed military support, she seduced generals. When she needed to secure alliances with nobility, she chose lovers from powerful families. When she wanted to appear cultured and intellectual, she romanced philosophers and artists. Her most famous relationship was with Grigory Potemkin, a military commander who helped her expand Russian territory. But even this wasn't a traditional romance. It was more like a political partnership disguised as a love affair. Catherine and Potemkin may have actually been secretly married, but they also openly encouraged each other to take other lovers for political advantage. Here's the really wild part. Catherine institutionalized her approach to royal romance. She created an official position called favourite, complete with a salary, housing, and specific duties. Being Catherine's boyfriend was literally a government job with benefits, but the most shocking aspect of Catherine's romantic life was how she managed the transition between lovers. When she was ready to move on from a relationship, she would arrange for her current favourite to discover her with his replacement. She turned romantic betrayal into a carefully choreographed political theatre. The crazy thing is, it worked. Catherine's strategic approach to romance helped her maintain power for over 30 years, expand Russian territory dramatically, and establish Russia as a major European power. She used love as a weapon more effectively than most monarchs used actual armies, but perhaps the most politically devastating royal romance in modern history was King Edward VIII's abdication for Wallis Simpson, a scandal that almost destroyed the British monarchy and had implications that reached all the way to World War II. Here's what most people don't know about the Edward and Wallis story. This wasn't just about a king choosing love over duty. This was about a monarch who was potentially sympathetic to Nazi Germany, and his obsession with an American divorcee gave the British government the perfect excuse to remove him from power. Edward's infatuation with Wallis Simpson was so intense that British intelligence actually considered it a national security threat. MI5 files, released decades later, reveal that government officials were genuinely worried that Edward's emotional dependence on Wallace made him vulnerable to foreign manipulation. But here's the really disturbing part. Edward didn't just abdicate quietly. He threw what can only be described as a royal temper tantrum that lasted for decades. After giving up the throne, Edward spent the rest of his life publicly criticizing the monarchy, making inflammatory political statements, and basically acting like a bitter ex-boyfriend on a global scale. The most shocking revelation came after World War II, when captured German documents showed that the Nazis had actually planned to reinstall Edward as a puppet king if they successfully invaded Britain. Hitler believed that Edward's resentment toward his family and his emotional instability made him the perfect candidate for collaboration. Can you imagine how different world history might have been if Edward had remained king during World War II? His romantic obsession didn't just affect his personal life, it potentially saved Britain from Nazi occupation. But here's what really gets me about all these royal romance scandals. They reveal something fundamental about the relationship between power and emotional maturity. When you have absolute authority and unlimited resources, normal relationship dynamics completely break down. Henry could literally reshape reality to get what he wanted, so he never learned how to handle rejection or disappointment. Catherine could turn romance into a political tool because she had the power to make love affairs into government positions. Edward could throw a decades-long tantrum because he had enough wealth and status to make his personal drama into international news. These weren't just relationship problems. They were symptoms of what happens when human beings are given power so absolute that they lose touch with normal emotional boundaries. But here's the most chilling realization. These romantic scandals weren't just personal dramas. They had real consequences for millions of ordinary people. Henry's religious wars killed countless innocents. Catherine's political maneuvering involved Russia in conflicts that cost thousands of lives. Edward's abdication crisis weakened the monarchy at a time when Britain needed strong leadership. The people who suffered the most from these royal love affairs were the ones who had no say in them. The subjects who died in wars started by lovesick kings, the citizens whose taxes funded elaborate romantic gestures, the soldiers who fought battles to secure marriages and divorces for monarchs they'd never meet. Think about it. Ordinary people throughout history have had their lives destroyed by the romantic choices of individuals they never encountered, living in palaces they'd never see, making decisions based on emotions and desires that had nothing to do with good governance. It makes you wonder, how many wars, how many religious conflicts, how many political disasters throughout history can be traced back to powerful people making terrible decisions because they were thinking with their hearts instead of their heads. As we dive deeper into royal madness, we're about to explore something that will make these romantic scandals seem almost reasonable. Because if you think royal love affairs were excessive, wait until you discover how monarchs treated their pets. We're talking about emperors who built palaces for their animals, queens who employed personal servants for their cats, and kings who spent more on their pets' comfort than most people earned in their entire lifetimes. The next stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about priorities, wealth, and what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited pet obsession. You know what they say about people and their pets. But when royals get obsessed with animals, the results are so extravagant, so absolutely ridiculous, that they make modern pet influencers look financially responsible. I'm about to share 6 royal pet stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about priorities, wealth, and what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited animal obsession. These aren't just cute stories about kings who love their dogs. These are tales of monarchs who spent more on their pets' daily comfort than most people earned in their entire lifetimes, who built architectural marvels for animals while their subjects lived in poverty, and who treated their pets with more respect and consideration than they showed to actual human beings. Let me start with a story that sounds so insane, you'll think I'm making it up. Catherine the Great, the same empress who revolutionized Russian politics and expanded the empire across 2 continents, decided that her cats needed their own palace. Not just a nice room in the royal residence, an actual full-sized palace built specifically for cats. The Hermitage Palace cat quarters, which still exist today, housed over 300 cats with individual servants assigned to each animal. We're talking about human beings whose full-time job was to serve the personal needs of individual cats. These servants had official titles, government salaries, and specific duties like grooming, feeding, and, I kid you not, entertaining the cats during their leisure time. But here's where it gets really absurd. Catherine insisted that her cats eat from silver bowls and sleep on silk cushions that were replaced daily. The annual budget for cat care at the Hermitage exceeded the military budgets of some smaller European nations, while Russian peasants were literally dying of starvation during harsh winters. Catherine was ensuring that her cats had heated marble floors and personal attendants to brush their fur. The most mind-boggling part. Catherine genuinely believed this was a reasonable use of imperial resources. In her letters to French philosophers, she wrote about her cats with the same seriousness that she discussed military strategy and international diplomacy. She saw pet care as a reflection of royal sophistication and cultural advancement. But if you think a cat palace is excessive, wait until you hear about Napoleon's wife Josephine and her pet orangutan named Rose. Yes, you heard that correctly. Josephine kept a fully grown orangutan as a house pet. But this wasn't just some exotic animal living in a cage. Rose the orangutan ate meals at the royal dining table, using actual silverware, and had her own chair during formal state dinners. Foreign diplomats visiting the French court wrote detailed accounts of the surreal experience of trying to conduct serious political negotiations, while a dressed-up orangutan sat at the table, occasionally interrupting conversations by throwing food or making loud noises. But here's the really wild part. Rose had her own personal tailor who created custom clothing for formal occasions. We're talking about hand-sewn dresses, jewelry, and even tiny shoes designed specifically for an orangutan's feet. The annual clothing budget for Josephine's pet exceeded the salaries of most government officials. The orangutan also had a dedicated servant whose only job was to follow Rose around the palace and clean up after her. And I mean everything. This poor person essentially spent their entire career being a professional orangutan assistant, which has to be one of the most bizarre job descriptions in human history. Now, Queen Victoria's relationship with her dogs makes modern pet obsession look absolutely normal by comparison. Victoria didn't just love her dogs. She was completely emotionally dependent on them in ways that affected actual government policy. Victoria's favourite dog, Sharp, had his own personal servant, his own carriage for transportation around London, and a daily schedule that was more elaborate than most people's work routines. Sharp attended cabinet meetings, had his own chair in the throne room, and was officially listed in court documents as having a government position. But here's where Victoria's pet obsession became genuinely disturbing. When Sharp died, Victoria declared a period of official mourning for the entire British Empire. Government offices closed, flags flew at half-mast, and Victoria refused to conduct any royal duties for 3 weeks because she was too devastated by her dog's death. Think about the absolute insanity of this. The most powerful empire in the world temporarily stopped functioning because the Queen was grieving for her pet. Meanwhile, actual human tragedies were happening throughout the British colonies, but those didn't warrant the same level of imperial attention as one dog's death. Victoria commissioned a marble tomb for Sharp that cost more than most people's houses, and she visited the grave daily for the rest of her 20-year life. She would conduct serious political meetings while wearing mourning jewellery that contained Sharp's hair, essentially treating her dead dog as a deceased family member worthy of the same respect as human royalty. But perhaps the most absolutely ridiculous royal pet story involves King Louis XIV of France and his pet pig named Groin. Yes, that was the pig's actual name. Louis didn't just keep this pig as a mascot or curiosity. Groin was treated as a full member of the royal court, complete with official titles, government duties, and a social rank higher than most human nobles. The pig wore custom-made jewellery, including a diamond-encrusted collar that was worth more than most people's annual income. Here's where it gets really absurd. Groin had his own bedroom in the palace, complete with a four-poster bed made specifically for a pig, silk sheets that were changed daily, and a personal valet whose job was to help the pig get dressed each morning. But wait, it gets worse. Louis insisted that Groin attend all important court functions, including diplomatic meetings with foreign ambassadors. Imagine being a serious political representative from another country, arriving to negotiate crucial international treaties, and discovering that you have to conduct formal diplomacy while a jeweled pig sits at the conference table. The pig also had voting rights in certain court decisions. Louis would literally ask for Groin's opinion on political matters and claim that the pig's behaviour indicated approval or disapproval of various policies. Government decisions that affected millions of people were sometimes influenced by how a pig reacted to different proposals, but the absolute pinnacle of royal pet insanity has to be Caligula's relationship with his horse, Incitatus. You've probably heard that Caligula made his horse a consul, but the full story is so much more bizarre than that simple fact suggests. Incitatus didn't just hold a government position, he had a complete political career. The horse had his own mansion, a team of servants, and a daily routine that included being carried around Rome in a golden litter, so citizens could pay their respects to their equine representative. But here's what most people don't know. Caligula insisted that Incitatus attend Senate meetings and participate in legislative debates. Senators were required to address the horse directly, ask for his opinions on proposed laws, and wait respectfully while Caligula translated the horse's responses. The horse also had his own military rank and was technically in command of actual Roman soldiers. There are documented cases of Caligula giving military orders in the horse's name, meaning that some of the most disciplined warriors in human history were taking battle commands from a horse. The most insane part? This wasn't just Caligula being eccentric, he was making a deliberate political point. By elevating his horse above human senators and generals, Caligula was essentially saying that his animal was more qualified for leadership than the most experienced politicians in the Roman Empire. But here's what really gets me about all these royal pet stories. They weren't just harmless eccentricities. These extravagant animal obsessions had real political and economic consequences. While Catherine was building palaces for cats, Russian infrastructure was crumbling and citizens were dying from preventable diseases. While Josephine was buying custom clothing for an orangutan, French soldiers were fighting wars without adequate supplies. While Victoria was mourning her dog, British colonial subjects were struggling with famines and conflicts that could have been addressed with proper imperial attention. The money spent on these pet obsessions could have built hospitals, schools, roads, or military defences. Instead, it went toward creating the most elaborate animal care systems in human history, benefiting creatures who had no understanding of the luxury being wasted on them. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these stories is what they reveal about royal priorities and emotional development. When you have unlimited power and resources, normal relationships with both humans and animals become completely distorted. These monarchs often showed more genuine affection and consideration for their pets than they did for their own family members, advisors, or subjects. They were capable of elaborate emotional displays over dead animals, while remaining completely indifferent to human suffering happening right outside their palace walls. It makes you wonder, how many important political decisions throughout history were influenced by monarchs who were more concerned with their pets' comfort than their citizens' welfare? How many resources that could have changed the course of civilizations were instead spent on jeweled pig collars and orangutan clothing? As we continue uncovering the darkest royal secrets, we're about to explore something that makes pet obsession look almost rational. Because if you think spending fortunes on animal comfort is extreme, wait until you discover the royal death mysteries that still baffle historians today. We're talking about monarchs whose deaths were so suspicious, so surrounded by conspiracy and intrigue, that modern forensic experts are still debating what really happened centuries later. The next stories involve poison plots, assassination theories, and royal deaths so mysterious that they've spawned legends, curses, and conspiracy theories that continue to captivate people hundreds of years after the fact. Death, they say, comes for everyone. But when you're royalty, even your final moments become the subject of centuries-long mysteries that baffle the greatest minds in history. I'm about to share 4 royal death stories so suspicious, so shrouded in conspiracy and intrigue, that modern forensic experts are still debating what really happened hundreds of years later. These aren't just historical footnotes about monarchs who died young. These are cases where the circumstances were so bizarre, the evidence so contradictory, and the political implications so massive that they've spawned legends, curses, and conspiracy theories that continue to captivate investigators today. We're talking about deaths that may have changed the entire course of world history. If only we could figure out what actually killed these rulers. Let me start with a mystery that has puzzled historians for over 2300 years. The death of Alexander the Great, the man who conquered most of the known world by age 30, only to die under circumstances so mysterious that we're still arguing about it today. Picture this. It's 323 BC in Babylon. Alexander, who has never lost a single battle, who has built an empire stretching from Greece to India, suddenly falls ill during a banquet. But this wasn't just any ordinary illness. The symptoms were so strange, so specific, that they've led to dozens of competing theories about what really happened. Here's what we know for certain. Alexander developed a high fever that lasted for 11 days, but witnesses described something much more disturbing than a typical fever. They reported that Alexander remained completely conscious and mentally sharp throughout his illness, able to give detailed military orders and conduct complex political discussions, even as his body systematically shut down. Ancient historians recorded that Alexander's voice disappeared completely, but his mind remained clear enough to remove his royal ring and hand it to his successor. Think about how terrifying that must have been. Watching the most powerful person in the world slowly die while remaining fully aware of what was happening to him. But here's where the mystery gets really intense. Modern toxicologists have analysed the ancient descriptions of Alexander's symptoms, and they point to a very specific type of poisoning. The 11-day progression, the loss of voice while maintaining mental clarity, the specific pattern of organ failure. It all matches perfectly with poisoning from a plant called white hellebore. But here's the problem. White hellebore doesn't grow anywhere near Babylon. If Alexander was poisoned with this substance, someone would have had to transport it thousands of miles specifically to kill him. That level of premeditation suggests a conspiracy involving multiple people, with access to rare botanical knowledge and international connections. The political implications are staggering. If Alexander was murdered, it means one of history's greatest military campaigns was cut short by assassination. The entire development of Western civilization might have been different if Alexander had lived to consolidate his empire and continue his conquests. But perhaps even more mysterious is the death of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb became one of archaeology's greatest discoveries, and whose death has become one of its greatest unsolved mysteries. When Howard Carter opened Tut's tomb in 1922, he expected to find answers about ancient Egyptian royal life. Instead, he discovered evidence of a death so suspicious that it's still generating new theories nearly a century later. Here's what makes Tut's death so mysterious. He died at approximately 18 years old, at the height of his political power, with no obvious signs of illness or disease. But modern CT scans of his mummy reveal injuries that suggest he didn't die peacefully in his sleep. The scans show a massive skull fracture, broken ribs, and a missing heart, which is particularly significant because ancient Egyptians considered the heart essential for the afterlife. The fact that embalmers removed Tut's heart suggests they were trying to hide evidence of how he died. But here's where it gets really weird. Chemical analysis of the mummification materials shows that Tut's body was embalmed in unusual haste. Normally, royal mummification took 70 days and involved elaborate rituals. Tut's body was preserved so quickly that the embalming chemicals actually caught fire while still inside the mummy wrappings. Why would embalmers rush the most important pharaoh's burial unless they were trying to conceal something? The hasty mummification destroyed evidence that might have revealed the true cause of death, which suggests that someone with political power wanted those details hidden. Recent DNA analysis has revealed another shocking detail. Tut's parents were brother and sister. The extreme inbreeding in his family line may have made him physically weak and politically vulnerable, creating the perfect conditions for assassination by rivals seeking power. But the most chilling aspect of Tut's death is what happened immediately afterward. His young wife, Ankhesenamun, sent desperate letters to enemy kingdoms begging for a foreign prince to marry her and protect her from Egyptian court politics. That level of fear suggests she knew her husband's death wasn't natural and that she might be next. The political ramifications were enormous. Tut's death essentially ended the most powerful dynasty in Egyptian history and led to decades of political chaos that weakened Egypt's international influence permanently. Moving forward in time, Napoleon's death on the island of St. Helena in 1821 presents another royal death mystery that has divided experts for over 2 centuries. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, but the circumstances surrounding Napoleon's final months are so suspicious that they've spawned one of history's most persistent conspiracy theories. And here's the really disturbing part. Recent scientific evidence suggests the conspiracy theorists might actually be right. Napoleon died in exile, supposedly from natural causes, but witnesses reported symptoms that don't match typical cancer progression. He experienced rapid hair loss, severe abdominal pain, and a dramatic personality change in his final months. But most significantly, his body showed almost no decomposition when it was exhumed 19 years later. That level of preservation is extremely unusual and suggests the presence of a preservative substance, like arsenic. In 1961, scientists analysed samples of Napoleon's hair using modern techniques and found arsenic levels that were 13 times higher than normal. But here's where the mystery gets complicated. The arsenic could have come from multiple sources. Some historians believe Napoleon was slowly poisoned by British agents who wanted to prevent any possibility of his return to power. Others think he was killed by French royalists who saw him as a permanent threat to the restored monarchy. But there's also evidence that the arsenic might have come from the wallpaper in his room, which contained arsenic-based green dye that could have gradually poisoned him through daily exposure. The political implications are massive. If Napoleon was murdered, it means one of history's most influential figures was assassinated by political enemies who feared his continued influence even in exile. His death removed the last obstacle to the restoration of traditional European monarchies and shaped the political development of 19th century Europe. But perhaps the most romantically mysterious royal death is Cleopatra's suicide in 30 BC. Except growing evidence suggests it might not have been suicide at all. The traditional story is that Cleopatra killed herself with a snake bite to avoid being captured by Roman forces. It's one of history's most famous death scenes, immortalized in countless works of art and literature. But when you examine the actual evidence, the snake bite story starts to fall apart. First, the logistics don't work. Asp venom, from the type of snake allegedly used, doesn't cause the peaceful death described in ancient accounts. Asp bites are incredibly painful and cause violent convulsions that last for hours. Witnesses described Cleopatra's death as serene and dignified, which is completely inconsistent with snake venom poisoning. Second, no one has ever satisfactorily explained how a deadly snake was smuggled past Roman guards into a heavily secured location. We're supposed to believe that the most closely watched prisoner in the Roman Empire somehow obtained a lethal weapon that no one noticed. Modern toxicologists have proposed a much more disturbing alternative. Cleopatra might have been murdered using a combination of opium, hemlock, and aconitine that would have caused a peaceful-looking death within minutes. This cocktail would have been virtually undetectable using ancient methods and would have appeared to be natural death. But here's the really chilling part. If Cleopatra was murdered, it means Roman propaganda deliberately created the snakebite story to make her death seem like a dramatic suicide rather than a cold-blooded political assassination. They turned murder into a romantic tragedy to justify their conquest of Egypt. The political consequences were enormous. Cleopatra's death ended the last independent Hellenistic kingdom and allowed Rome to become the sole Mediterranean superpower. If she was assassinated rather than committing suicide, it means this world-changing event was the result of calculated murder rather than desperate honor. What's truly fascinating about all these royal death mysteries is how they reveal the intersection of personal tragedy and political power. In each case, the mysterious circumstances weren't just about individual lives. They were about the future of entire civilizations. When Alexander died, his empire immediately fragmented into competing kingdoms that spent centuries fighting each other. When Tut died, Egyptian power collapsed and never fully recovered. When Napoleon died, European monarchies solidified their restoration. When Cleopatra died, the ancient world's political balance shifted permanently. But here's what really haunts me about these stories. We may never know the truth. Despite all our modern technology, advanced forensic techniques, and sophisticated historical analysis, the deaths of some of history's most important figures remain complete mysteries. These weren't just powerful people who died, they were individuals whose deaths changed the course of human civilization, and we still don't understand what actually killed them. It makes you wonder how many other pivotal moments in history were the result of events we'll never fully comprehend. As we delve deeper into royal madness, we're about to explore something that makes mysterious death seem almost rational. Because if you think royal assassination plots are extreme, wait until you discover the fashion trends that literally bankrupted entire kingdoms. We're talking about clothing choices so extravagant, so financially devastating, that they toppled governments and sparked revolutions. The next stories involve fashion obsessions so expensive that they cost more than some nations' entire annual budgets, ultimately leading to political upheavals that changed world history forever. Imagine spending so much money on a single dress that it literally bankrupts your entire country and sparks a revolution that cost you your head. Sound impossible? Well, throughout history, royal fashion choices have been so extravagant, so financially devastating, that they've toppled governments, destroyed economies, and changed the course of world history. I'm about to tell you 3 fashion stories that will make modern designer prices look like clearance sales. These aren't just tales of expensive clothing, These are accounts of monarchs whose vanity became so extreme that their wardrobe choices destroyed entire kingdoms and led to political upheavals that echo through centuries. The first story takes us to the court of Marie Antoinette, where fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was about displaying wealth so extreme that it became a weapon of political destruction. Here's what most people don't understand about Marie Antoinette's fashion expenses. We're not talking about buying expensive dresses occasionally. We're talking about a systematic approach to luxury that consumed more money than some European nations' entire annual budgets. Marie Antoinette's dress allowance in 1788 was 258,000 livres per year. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to about $12 million in today's money, just for clothes. But here's the really insane part. That was just her official allowance. Her actual spending was nearly double that amount when you include jewellery, accessories, and what she called minor fashion purchases. But the individual pieces were even more shocking than the total budget. Marie Antoinette once commissioned a single gown that cost 36,000 livres. That's roughly $1.7 million for one dress. This wasn't even for a coronation or major state event. It was for a casual court appearance that lasted about 3 hours. The construction details of these dresses were absolutely mind-boggling. Her most expensive gowns contained real silver and gold thread woven throughout the fabric. The embroidery alone on some pieces took skilled craftsmen over 6 months to complete, working 12 hours a day. We're talking about hundreds of people spending their entire working lives creating clothing for one woman to wear a few times before discarding. But here's where it gets really disturbing. While Marie Antoinette was spending fortunes on single dresses, detailed financial records show that French peasants were literally starving. The average French citizen earned about 200 livres per year, meaning that Marie Antoinette's annual dress budget could have fed over 1,000 families for an entire year. The political consequences were catastrophic. When news of her fashion expenses reached the starving population, it became one of the primary catalysts for the French Revolution. Pamphlets circulated throughout Paris detailing exactly how much Marie Antoinette spent on clothing while common people couldn't afford bread. The most damning piece of evidence was a receipt that revolutionaries found in the palace archives. Marie Antoinette had spent 87,000 livres on a single shopping trip, while France was facing its worst famine in decades. That receipt became Exhibit A in the case for her execution. But if you think Marie Antoinette's dress expenses were extreme, the Spanish court's obsession with silver threading created an economic disaster that destroyed an empire. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish royalty developed a fashion trend that seemed harmless, but had absolutely devastating economic consequences. They became obsessed with incorporating real silver thread into every piece of their clothing, from underwear to formal court dress. This wasn't just a matter of vanity. It became a requirement for anyone appearing at court. Spanish nobility were literally required to wear clothing containing actual precious metals, or they would be banned from royal functions. Can you imagine a dress code that mandates wearing silver and gold as clothing material? Here's where the economics become absolutely insane. Spain had access to massive silver mines in the New World, so initially this seemed like a reasonable way to display national wealth. But the Spanish court's fashion demands became so extreme that they were consuming more silver for clothing than the rest of Europe combined used for currency. By 1650, Spanish fashion requirements were consuming approximately 40% of all silver imported from the Americas. Think about that. Nearly half of the wealth flowing from the New World was being turned into clothing trim that would be worn a few times and then discarded. But here's the really devastating part. This massive consumption of silver for fashion created artificial scarcity that drove up silver prices across Europe. Spain was essentially inflating the value of its own currency by turning it into disposable fashion accessories. The economic consequences were catastrophic. As silver became more expensive due to fashion demand, Spanish currency became overvalued compared to other European currencies. This made Spanish exports incredibly expensive and imports artificially cheap, destroying Spanish manufacturing and creating a trade deficit that bankrupted the kingdom. Spanish financial records from 1665 show that the kingdom was spending more on silver thread for court fashion than on its entire military budget. While Spain was losing territories and influence to other European powers, the royal court was literally wearing the national treasury as clothing decorations. The fashion obsession contributed directly to Spain's decline from the most powerful empire in Europe to a second-rate power by the end of the 17th century. Historians estimate that Spanish silver fashion trends cost the empire the equivalent of $50 billion in modern currency over just 50 years. But perhaps the most economically destructive royal fashion trend in history was the Chinese imperial court's silk monopoly and the lengths they went to maintain fashion exclusivity. For over 2,000 years, Chinese emperors maintained absolute control over silk production, not just for economic reasons, but because they believed that certain types of silk clothing were literally divine. The emperor's robes weren't just expensive, they were considered sacred objects that connected the ruler to heavenly powers. But here's where the fashion obsession became economically insane. Chinese emperors decreed that certain colours and patterns of silk could only be worn by specific members of the royal family. They created a fashion hierarchy so complex that it required entire government departments to monitor and enforce. The most exclusive imperial silk, called forbidden yellow, could only be worn by the emperor himself. The production process was so complex and secretive that it required over 300 specialized craftsmen working for 6 months to create a single ceremonial robe. But here's the really wild part. The Chinese court maintained this silk monopoly through state-sponsored fashion espionage. They literally executed anyone who tried to smuggle silk-making techniques out of China, and they maintained networks of spies throughout Asia to prevent other kingdoms from developing competing silk industries. The economic costs were staggering. Chinese imperial records show that silk production for court fashion consumed approximately 25% of the empire's agricultural labor force. Millions of people spent their entire lives producing luxury clothing for a few hundred royal family members, while the general population wore simple cotton or hemp. But the most economically devastating aspect was the opportunity cost. While China was devoting massive resources to maintaining fashion monopolies, other civilizations were developing new technologies, expanding trade networks, and advancing scientifically. The Chinese obsession with silk fashion exclusivity contributed to what historians call the Great Divergence, the period when European economies began outpacing Chinese development despite China's earlier technological advantages. When the Silk Road trade routes finally broke China's monopoly in the 15th century, the economic shock was enormous. The Chinese economy had become so dependent on luxury fashion exports that losing the monopoly contributed to political instability that lasted for centuries. Here's what really gets me about all these royal fashion disasters. They weren't just personal extravagances that affected wealthy people. These fashion choices had massive economic and political consequences that destroyed the lives of millions of ordinary citizens. When Marie Antoinette spent fortunes on dresses, it wasn't just waste. It was money that could have been used for infrastructure, military defense, or famine relief. When Spanish royalty turned currency into clothing trim, they destroyed their entire economy. When Chinese emperors monopolized silk production for fashion, they stunted their civilization's development for centuries. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these stories is how disconnected these monarchs were from the real-world consequences of their fashion choices. They lived in such isolated luxury that they genuinely couldn't understand how their clothing expenses affected ordinary people. Marie Antoinette reportedly asked why people were upset about her dress expenses when they could simply wear less expensive clothing. Spanish royalty couldn't comprehend why the kingdom was going bankrupt when they had so much beautiful silver clothing. Chinese emperors believed that their fashion monopolies were necessary for maintaining cosmic order and couldn't understand why economic development mattered. These weren't just fashion mistakes. They were symptoms of political systems that gave individuals unlimited power to make decisions that affected millions of people, without any accountability or understanding of real-world consequences. It makes you wonder how many economic disasters throughout history can be traced back to powerful people making terrible decisions because they were more concerned with their appearance than their responsibilities. How many kingdoms fell? How many people suffered? How many civilizations declined because their leaders prioritized looking good over governing well? As we continue exploring the depths of royal madness, we're about to encounter something that makes expensive fashion look almost reasonable. Because if you think spending fortunes on clothing is extreme, wait until you discover the superstitions and paranormal obsessions that consumed royal minds. We're talking about kings and queens so terrified of curses, omens, and supernatural threats that they made decisions affecting millions of people based on astrology, ghost sightings, and occult predictions. The next stories involve monarchs who were so consumed by supernatural fears that they essentially governed their kingdoms according to the advice of fortune tellers, mystics, and con artists claiming magical powers. When you have unlimited power over millions of people, what becomes your greatest fear? For many royals throughout history, the answer wasn't war, rebellion, or political rivals. It was the supernatural. I'm about to share 5 royal superstitions so extreme, so all-consuming, that they make modern conspiracy theories look like casual concerns. These aren't just quirky beliefs about lucky charms or unlucky numbers. These are stories of monarchs who were so terrified of curses, omens, and supernatural threats that they literally governed entire kingdoms based on the advice of fortune tellers, mystics, and con artists claiming magical powers. We're talking about rulers who made life and death decisions affecting millions of people because a psychic told them to, or because they believed ancient curses were hunting them down. Let me start with the most elaborate supernatural security system in royal history. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs' obsession with death rituals that were so extreme, they essentially turned murder into a religious ceremony. The pharaohs didn't just believe in life after death. They were absolutely convinced that their supernatural power in the afterlife depended on taking their most important servants with them. We're talking about rulers who institutionalized human sacrifice on a scale that makes modern cult behavior look restrained. When Pharaoh Jer died around 3000 BC, archaeologists have found evidence that 338 people were buried alive alongside him. Not killed and then buried alive. These weren't just random servants. They were skilled craftsmen, personal advisors, favorite concubines, and even high-ranking government officials who were considered essential for the pharaoh's supernatural comfort in the afterlife. But here's where it gets really disturbing. These people weren't forced into this arrangement. Ancient Egyptian records show that many of these death servants actually volunteered for live burial because they believed it guaranteed them eternal luxury in the afterlife. The pharaohs had created a religious system so psychologically powerful that people willingly chose horrible deaths for supernatural benefits. The most shocking part. This practice continued for over 1,000 years. Generation after generation of the most intelligent, educated people in the ancient world convinced themselves that mass human sacrifice was not only reasonable, but essential for cosmic order. Think about the political implications. Egyptian pharaohs were literally killing their most valuable human resources based on supernatural beliefs. They were eliminating skilled workers, experienced advisors, and talented artists because they thought it would help them in an imaginary afterlife. But if ancient Egyptian death rituals seem extreme, the Russian royal family's relationship with Rasputin reveals how supernatural fears can completely undermine political stability in the modern world. Rasputin wasn't just some mystical advisor who had unusual influence over the Russian court. He was a con artist who successfully convinced the most powerful monarchy in Europe that their son's life depended on his supernatural abilities, and he used that leverage to essentially control Russian government policy. Here's what most people don't understand about the Rasputin situation. Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra weren't just superstitious peasants who believed in magic. They were educated, sophisticated monarchs who had access to the best medical care in the world. But their son Alexei suffered from haemophilia, a condition that early 20th century medicine couldn't effectively treat. Rasputin discovered that he could seemingly stop Alexei's bleeding episodes, probably through hypnosis or simply calming the child during medical crises. But he convinced the royal family that his power was supernatural and that the boy would die without his continued mystical intervention. The political consequences were catastrophic. Rasputin used his supposed magical abilities to influence major government decisions, military appointments, and even Russia's involvement in World War I. Russian ministers were chosen not based on their qualifications, but on whether Rasputin claimed to have supernatural visions about their suitability. But here's the really insane part. The Russian royal family continued believing in Rasputin's powers even after he was publicly exposed as a fraud multiple times. Court investigators documented that Rasputin was an alcoholic, sexual predator, and con artist, but the Tsar and Tsarina refused to dismiss him because they were convinced their son would die without his supernatural protection. When Rasputin was finally assassinated in 1916, the royal family interpreted his death as a supernatural omen predicting their own doom. This belief in supernatural inevitability contributed to their political paralysis during the Russian Revolution, essentially ensuring their downfall. The irony is devastating. The Russian monarchy's faith in one man's supposed supernatural powers directly contributed to the revolution that destroyed them and led to decades of Soviet rule that killed millions of people. Moving to a different kind of supernatural obsession, King Louis XIV's terror of being alone reveals how paranoia can become institutionalized royal policy. Louis wasn't just uncomfortable with solitude. He was genuinely convinced that being alone made him vulnerable to supernatural attack. He believed that evil spirits, political curses, and malevolent forces could only harm him when he was isolated from other people. So Louis created the most elaborate anti-supernatural security system in royal history. He required that at least 100 courtiers be present in his vicinity at all times, day and night. We're talking about people whose full-time job was literally to stand around the king to protect him from imaginary supernatural threats. But this wasn't just about having people nearby. Louis developed an incredibly complex system of supernatural protection protocols. Different courtiers had specific assignments based on their astrological signs, birth dates, and what Louis believed were their supernatural protective qualities. The economic costs were staggering. Maintaining 100-plus people in constant attendance required enormous resources for housing, feeding, and paying these supernatural bodyguards. French financial records show that Louis spent more on supernatural protection than on actual military security. But the political consequences were even more destructive. Because Louis couldn't be alone, he couldn't have private conversations with advisors, couldn't make confidential diplomatic communications, and couldn't engage in any form of private decision-making. Important government business had to be conducted in front of crowds of courtiers, making confidential policy discussions impossible. foreign ambassadors reported that negotiating with France was nearly impossible because nothing could be discussed privately with the king. Perhaps the most disturbing royal supernatural obsession involves medieval kings who employed sin-eaters, people whose job was to literally absorb the monarch's wrongdoings through mystical ceremonies. Medieval European monarchs genuinely believed that their political decisions created supernatural consequences that could damn their souls. But instead of making better decisions, they developed a system where they could transfer their guilt to other people through magical rituals. Sin-eaters were usually desperate, impoverished individuals who agreed to participate in ceremonies where they would symbolically consume the king's sins in exchange for money. These rituals involved the sin-eater literally eating bread and drinking wine while reciting incantations designed to transfer the monarch's supernatural guilt. But here's where it gets really dark. Many kings became addicted to this process. They would commit increasingly terrible acts knowing they could transfer the supernatural consequences to sin-eaters. It was like having a magical get-out-of-jail-free card for moral behaviour. King Henry VII employed sin-eaters so frequently that he essentially created a cottage industry of people whose livelihood depended on absorbing royal guilt. These individuals lived in poverty while taking on the supernatural burden of royal crimes, believing they were damning their own souls to protect the king's afterlife prospects. The political implications were horrifying. Monarchs who believed they could magically transfer the consequences of their actions had no incentive to govern ethically or consider the moral implications of their decisions. But perhaps the most persistent royal supernatural obsession involves the modern British royal family's continued belief in what they call the Windsor Curse, a superstition that continues to influence their behaviour today. Members of the British royal family genuinely believe that certain numbers, dates, and locations are supernaturally dangerous for them. They avoid travelling on specific dates, refuse to stay in certain royal residences, and make important decisions based on astrological consultations. Queen Elizabeth II reportedly consulted astrologers before making major royal announcements and refused to schedule important events on dates that psychics claimed were supernaturally unfavourable for the monarchy. But here's what's really wild. This isn't just private superstition. These supernatural beliefs actually influence British government policy. Important parliamentary sessions, military decisions, and international diplomatic events are sometimes scheduled around royal superstitions about supernatural timing. Modern royal family members carry protective charms, avoid certain colours on specific dates, and even choose their children's names based on numerological consultations. We're talking about people in the 21st century making major life decisions based on magical thinking. Here's what really disturbs me about all these royal supernatural obsessions. They reveal how unlimited power can completely disconnect people from rational thinking. When you have absolute authority and no accountability, apparently magical thinking becomes indistinguishable from practical decision-making. These weren't just harmless personal beliefs. They were superstitions that affected the lives of millions of people. When pharaohs killed hundreds of servants for supernatural reasons, when Russian czars made government appointments based on mystical visions, when French kings couldn't conduct private diplomacy because of supernatural fears, ordinary citizens suffered the consequences. But perhaps the most chilling realization is how these supernatural obsessions made royal decision-making completely unpredictable. How do you negotiate with a monarch who believes their political choices are determined by supernatural forces? How do you reason with someone who thinks ancient curses are more important than economic data or military intelligence? Throughout history, some of the most important political decisions were made not based on logic, strategy, or the welfare of citizens, but on whether a psychic had a good or bad feeling about supernatural omens. As we continue peeling back the layers of royal madness, we're about to explore something that makes supernatural obsessions seem almost quaint. Because if you think believing in curses is extreme, wait until you discover the spy networks and intelligence operations that royals created to monitor their own subjects. We're talking about surveillance systems so sophisticated, so paranoid, and so invasive that they make modern government surveillance look like casual social media monitoring. The next stories involve monarchs who were so terrified of their own people that they created intelligence networks more advanced than anything that existed until the modern era. Fear makes people do terrible things, but when the most powerful person in the world becomes genuinely terrified of their own subjects, the results are surveillance systems so sophisticated, so paranoid, and so invasive that they make modern government monitoring look like amateur hour. I'm about to reveal 4 royal intelligence networks that were so advanced, so psychologically twisted, that they essentially turned entire kingdoms into open-air prisons where every citizen was a potential threat. These weren't just kings and queens with trust issues. These were monarchs who created spy operations more complex than anything that existed until the modern CIA, surveillance networks that monitored millions of people, and intelligence systems that turned neighbours into informants and family members into government agents. Let me start with what might be the most sophisticated intelligence operation in pre-modern history. Elizabeth I's spy network under Francis Walsingham, a system so advanced that it essentially invented modern espionage. Most people think of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada, but what they don't realise is that she survived and thrived because she created the most paranoid surveillance state in European history. Elizabeth was convinced that every Catholic in England was a potential assassin, every foreign diplomat was a spy, and every nobleman might be plotting her overthrow. So she gave Francis Walsingham unlimited resources to create what he called the eyes and ears of the realm. We're talking about a surveillance network that employed over 50 full-time international agents, hundreds of domestic informants, and a communication system that could deliver intelligence from anywhere in Europe to London within 2 weeks. But here's where it gets really impressive and terrifying. Walsingham didn't just collect information. He actively manipulated political events across multiple countries to protect Elizabeth's interests. His agents didn't just spy on foreign courts, they influenced foreign policy, assassinated political threats, and essentially ran covert operations that changed the course of European politics. The most famous example was the Babington Plot of 1586. Mary Queen of Scots was planning Elizabeth's assassination through a network of Catholic conspirators. But here's the truly chilling part. Walsingham knew about the plot from the beginning. His agents were embedded so deeply in the conspiracy that they were actually helping to plan the assassination attempt. Why? Because Walsingham wanted the conspirators to fully commit to their treasonous plan so he could execute them all at once and eliminate the Catholic threat permanently. He let a plot against the Queen's life develop for months, knowing exactly when and how it would unfold, so he could use it to justify mass executions. Think about the psychological coldness required for this strategy. Walsingham was willing to let assassins get dangerously close to killing Elizabeth, because he wanted to catch them in the act for maximum political impact. The operation worked perfectly. Walsingham's evidence was so comprehensive that Mary Queen of Scots, Anthony Babington, and 14 other conspirators were all executed. But the really disturbing part is that Walsingham's agents may have actually encouraged the plot more than they prevented it. This intelligence network cost approximately 20% of England's annual government budget, but Elizabeth considered it essential for survival. She was literally spending more on spying on her own subjects than on feeding them during famines. But if Walsingham's network was sophisticated, Catherine de' Medici's poison ring represents the absolute pinnacle of royal paranoia turned into systematic assassination policy. Catherine wasn't just worried about political threats. She was convinced that anyone who opposed her family's interests deserved to die. So she created what historians call the first institutionalized assassination program in European history. Catherine employed a team of specialist poisoners who developed over 40 different lethal substances, each designed for specific types of murders. She had poisons that mimicked natural diseases, toxins that worked slowly over months to avoid suspicion, and substances that could be administered through clothing, jewelry, or even perfume. But here's where Catherine's operation becomes truly terrifying. She didn't just target obvious political enemies. Her poison ring eliminated anyone who might potentially become a threat in the future. We're talking about preemptive murders based on political predictions and personal grudges. Italian court records document at least 200 suspicious deaths that can be traced to Catherine's network. But the real number was probably much higher, because her poisons were specifically designed to be undetectable, using 16th century medical knowledge. The most chilling aspect was how Catherine recruited her poisoners. She specifically sought out people who had personal reasons to hate certain political figures, then provided them with means and opportunity to commit untraceable murders. She was essentially weaponizing personal grudges for state assassination purposes. Catherine's agents weren't just poisoners, they were skilled actors who could pose as servants, diplomats, merchants, or even priests to get close to their targets. She created an entire network of people whose full-time job was finding creative ways to murder political threats. The psychological effect on European courts was devastating. Diplomatic meetings became exercises in mutual paranoia, with everyone suspicious of everyone else. International relations essentially broke down because no one could trust that their negotiating partners weren't trying to poison them. French financial records show that Catherine spent more on her assassination network than on legitimate diplomatic operations. She was literally prioritizing murder over normal statecraft. Moving to an even more psychologically disturbing surveillance system, Louis XIV created what might be the most invasive royal monitoring operation in history, turning the entire court of Versailles into an elaborate spy network where every social interaction was political intelligence. Louis wasn't just paranoid about external threats. He was convinced that any private conversation among nobles was potential treason. So he designed Versailles not just as a palace, but as a surveillance machine where privacy was literally impossible. The architecture of Versailles was specifically designed for spying. There were hidden passages behind every major room, concealed listening posts near every gathering area, and a complex system of mirrors that allowed observers to monitor conversations from multiple angles simultaneously. But here's the really genius and terrifying part. Louis turned surveillance into a competitive social activity. Courtiers were encouraged to report on each other's private conversations, romantic affairs, and political opinions in exchange for royal favor and advancement opportunities. Louis created a system where spying on your friends and family wasn't just expected. It was the primary way to succeed at court. People competed to provide the most interesting intelligence about their social circle, turning personal relationships into intelligence-gathering operations. The psychological pressure was enormous. Nobles at Versailles had to assume that every conversation was being monitored, every friendship was potentially compromised, and every private moment might be reported to the king. French court records show that Louis received detailed daily reports on the private activities of over 3,000 noble families. We're talking about intelligence files that documented everything from marital problems to financial difficulties to personal health issues. But the most disturbing aspect was how this surveillance system affected noble behavior. People stopped having genuine friendships, stopped expressing honest opinions, and stopped engaging in any activity that might be interpreted as politically suspicious. Louis essentially created a kingdom where authentic human relationships were impossible. because everyone was constantly performing for invisible government observers. However, perhaps the most sophisticated ancient surveillance operation belonged to the Chinese emperors, who created intelligence networks that monitored over 60 million people using techniques that wouldn't be out of place in a modern totalitarian state. The Chinese imperial intelligence system wasn't just about monitoring political threats. It was about collecting detailed information on every aspect of life throughout the empire. Chinese emperors wanted to know what people were eating, who they were marrying, what they were discussing in private, and even what they were dreaming about. The scope was absolutely staggering. Chinese intelligence networks employed over 100,000 full-time informants who reported on everything from local economic conditions to private family disputes to religious activities. But here's where the Chinese system becomes truly mind-blowing. They created standardized intelligence gathering protocols that allowed them to collect comparable data from every region of the empire. This wasn't just random spying, it was systematic social science using surveillance data. Chinese intelligence reports from the Tang dynasty include detailed statistics on regional dialects, local customs, economic productivity, and even popular songs and jokes. The emperors were essentially conducting comprehensive sociological research through massive espionage operations. The most impressive aspect was the communication system. Chinese intelligence networks could deliver detailed reports from the most remote provinces to the imperial capital within 30 days, using a relay system of professional messengers and coded communications that remained unbroken for over 1,000 years. But perhaps the most chilling feature was the psychological profiling system. Chinese intelligence services created detailed personality assessments of potential political threats, analyzing their emotional weaknesses, family relationships, and personal habits to predict and prevent rebellious behavior. These weren't just surveillance operations. They were comprehensive social control systems designed to make organized resistance psychologically impossible. Here's what really disturbs me about all these royal intelligence networks. They reveal how power and paranoia create a vicious cycle that ultimately destroys the very thing they're trying to protect. Elizabeth's spy network made England safer from foreign threats, but it also created a culture of suspicion that made normal political discourse impossible. Catherine's poison ring eliminated her enemies, but it also made diplomatic relationships so toxic that France became increasingly isolated. Louis's surveillance system prevented noble conspiracies, but it also destroyed the authentic social relationships that made court life meaningful. These surveillance operations were supposed to protect royal power, but they actually undermined the social foundations that legitimate authority depends on. When people can't trust their neighbours, can't express honest opinions, and can't form genuine relationships, they stop being loyal subjects and start becoming potential rebels. The irony is devastating. Royal paranoia created exactly the conditions that justified royal paranoia. The more these monarchs spied on their people, the more their people had reason to resent and eventually rebel against them. But what's truly terrifying is realizing how advanced these historical surveillance systems were. With nothing but human intelligence, coded communications, and psychological manipulation, these royal networks achieved levels of social monitoring that rival modern digital surveillance capabilities. It makes you wonder, if royals with medieval technology could create such comprehensive surveillance states, what are modern governments capable of with digital tools, artificial intelligence, and global communication networks? As we dive deeper into royal madness, we're about to explore something that makes even the most sophisticated spy networks seem rational. Because if you think royal paranoia about political threats is extreme, wait until you discover the medical practices that kings and queens voluntarily subjected themselves to. We're talking about royal healthcare so barbaric, so dangerously experimental, that it would be considered torture by modern standards. The next stories involve monarchs who paid fortunes for medical treatments that were literally designed to cause pain, believing that agony was somehow essential for royal health. Picture yourself willingly paying someone to drill holes in your skull while you're fully conscious, believing this will cure your headaches and make you a better ruler. Sound insane? Well, for centuries, the most powerful monarchs in the world subjected themselves to medical treatments so barbaric, so dangerously experimental, that they would be considered torture by any modern standard. I'm about to share 3 royal medical practices that will make you grateful for modern healthcare, and question how these supposedly intelligent rulers convinced themselves that agony was essential for good health. These aren't just stories about primitive medicine. These are accounts of monarchs who paid fortunes for treatments specifically designed to cause pain, believing that suffering was somehow the key to royal wellness. The first practice is so horrifying that it sounds like something from a medieval horror movie. Trepanation, the process of drilling holes in living skulls, was considered the pinnacle of royal medical care for over 500 years. Here's what makes royal trepanation so disturbing. This wasn't emergency surgery performed on desperate patients. This was elective procedure that healthy monarchs requested regularly, believing that releasing evil vapors from their brains would improve their decision-making abilities and prevent political mistakes. King Charles II of England underwent trepanation procedures at least 6 times during his reign, paying royal physicians enormous sums to drill holes in his skull while he remained fully conscious. Medieval medical records describe the process in horrifying detail. Physicians would use specialized drills to slowly bore through the skull bone while the patient was held down by multiple assistants. But here's the really insane part. Charles insisted on staying awake during these procedures because he believed that consciousness was essential for the medical benefits. He wanted to feel the evil spirits leaving his brain through the holes. The medical logic was completely backwards. Royal physicians convinced monarchs that headaches, confusion, and poor judgment were caused by supernatural vapors trapped inside the skull. They claimed that creating holes would allow these vapors to escape, resulting in clearer thinking and better royal decision-making. Think about the absolute madness of this belief system. The most powerful people in the world were voluntarily having their skulls drilled because they thought it would make them smarter. The pain was considered proof that the treatment was working. French royal medical records from the 14th century document over 200 trepanation procedures performed on members of the royal family. We're talking about an entire dynasty that regularly underwent skull drilling as routine healthcare, but the most disturbing aspect was the social pressure involved. Royal trepanation became a status symbol among European nobility. Kings and queens who refused the procedure were considered weak or superstitious, while those who underwent multiple surgeries were praised for their commitment to optimal royal health. The survival rate was approximately 30%. This means that 70% of people who underwent royal trepanation died from the procedure, usually from infection or brain damage. But the medical establishment considered this an acceptable risk for the supposed benefits of releasing brain vapors. Can you imagine living in a world where drilling holes in your head was considered sophisticated healthcare, and refusing this treatment meant you weren't taking your royal responsibilities seriously? But if trepanation seems extreme, royal bloodletting practices reveal an even more systematic approach to medical torture disguised as healthcare. Medieval royal physicians developed bloodletting into an elaborate pseudoscience that involved removing enormous quantities of blood from healthy monarchs on a regular schedule. This wasn't occasional medical treatment. This was routine healthcare that left royals in states of chronic weakness and anemia. King Louis XVIII of France underwent bloodletting procedures 3 times per week for the final 10 years of his life. Royal medical records show that physicians typically removed between 1 and 2 pints of blood per session. meaning that Louis was losing up to 6 pints of blood weekly. To put that in perspective, losing 2 pints of blood is considered a serious medical emergency today. Louis was voluntarily subjecting himself to medical emergencies 3 times per week because his physicians convinced him it was essential for royal health. But here's where the bloodletting obsession becomes truly disturbing. Royal physicians developed increasingly creative methods for blood removal that were designed to be as painful and dramatic as possible. They used specialized devices called scarificators that made multiple cuts simultaneously, creating elaborate patterns of wounds that would bleed for hours. Some royal bloodletting sessions involved up to 50 individual cuts across the patient's body, essentially turning healthcare into a ritualized form of self-harm. The medical theory was that different types of blood came from different parts of the body, and that removing blood from specific locations would cure particular ailments. Royal physicians created detailed charts showing which body parts should be cut to treat various royal health problems. For example, blood from the forehead was supposed to cure political indecision, blood from the wrists was thought to improve diplomatic skills, and blood from the ankles was believed to enhance military strategy abilities. Medieval royal medical texts describe bloodletting sessions that lasted for hours, with monarchs losing consciousness from blood loss while physicians continued the procedures. The fainting was considered a positive sign that the treatment was working effectively, but perhaps the most shocking royal medical practice involved mercury treatments that were literally designed to poison the patient as a form of healthcare. From the 15th to the 18th centuries, royal physicians prescribed mercury consumption for everything from depression to digestive problems to skin conditions. But mercury is an extremely toxic heavy metal that causes severe neurological damage, organ failure, and eventual death. King Charles II of Spain consumed mercury-based medicines daily for over 20 years, believing they were essential for maintaining royal health. Historical medical records show that Charles developed all the classic symptoms of mercury poisoning: tremors, memory loss, personality changes, and eventual complete mental breakdown. But here's the really insane part. Royal physicians interpreted these obvious poisoning symptoms as signs that the mercury treatments were working. They claimed that tremors meant the medicine was activating royal energy, that memory loss indicated purification of royal thoughts, and that personality changes proved enhancement of royal character. The more obvious the mercury poisoning became, the more convinced physicians were that the treatments were successful. Charles's deteriorating health was seen as evidence that he needed even more mercury medicine. Spanish royal medical records document mercury prescriptions that would be lethal by any modern standard. Charles was consuming approximately 10 times the amount of mercury that would cause immediate death in most people, spread out over years of daily doses. The psychological effects were devastating. Mercury poisoning causes severe personality disorders, paranoid delusions, and violent mood swings. Many of Charles's most erratic political decisions can be directly attributed to mercury-induced mental illness, but the medical establishment never connected the mercury treatments to Charles's obvious mental deterioration. When he died at age 39 from what was clearly mercury poisoning, royal physicians claimed his death proved he hadn't received enough mercury medicine during his lifetime. This wasn't just one misguided monarch. Mercury-based royal medicine was standard practice across European courts for over 300 years. Entire dynasties were systematically poisoning themselves while paying enormous fees for the privilege. Here's what really disturbs me about these royal medical practices. They weren't just examples of primitive healthcare knowledge. They were symptoms of how absolute power creates environments where nobody can challenge obviously dangerous decisions. Royal physicians couldn't admit that their treatments were harmful, because that would mean admitting they were torturing their patients. Monarchs couldn't acknowledge that the treatments were making them sicker, because that would mean admitting they were paying fortunes for medical torture. The result was a medical system based entirely on wishful thinking and political pressure, where the patient's actual health was less important than maintaining the illusion that royal medicine was sophisticated and effective. But the most chilling aspect is realizing how these medical practices affected royal decision-making. Monarchs who were regularly subjected to skull drilling, blood loss, and mercury poisoning were making political decisions that affected millions of people while suffering from chronic pain, anemia, and heavy metal poisoning. How many wars were started by kings with mercury-induced paranoid delusions? How many economic policies were created by monarchs weakened by chronic blood loss? How many diplomatic disasters resulted from royal decision-making impaired by repeated brain surgery? These medical practices weren't just personal health choices. They were factors that influenced the course of world history by systematically damaging the mental and physical capabilities of the people making the most important political decisions. It makes you wonder about the relationship between power and medical decision-making. When you have unlimited authority and unlimited resources, apparently even obviously harmful medical treatments become acceptable if they're presented as sophisticated royal healthcare. The fact that intelligent, educated monarchs voluntarily subjected themselves to these tortures for centuries reveals something deeply disturbing about how power affects rational thinking and self-preservation instincts. But as shocking as royal medical practices were, they pale in comparison to what we're about to explore next. Because if you think voluntarily drilling holes in your skull is extreme, wait until you discover the construction projects that royals considered reasonable uses of national resources. We're talking about building projects so massive, so expensive, and so utterly pointless that they bankrupted entire kingdoms and cost more human lives than most wars. The next stories involve architectural obsessions so grandiose that they make modern billionaire mansions look like modest cottages, construction projects that consume the labor of entire generations while accomplishing absolutely nothing useful. What happens when someone with unlimited power and unlimited resources decides they want to build something truly spectacular? Throughout history, royal construction projects have reached levels of excess so extreme that they make modern billionaire mansions look like garden sheds. I'm about to share 6 royal building projects so massive, so expensive, and so utterly insane that they bankrupted entire nations, killed thousands of workers, and accomplished absolutely nothing except satisfying royal ego. These weren't just expensive palaces or impressive monuments. These were construction projects that consumed more resources than most countries' entire economies, building efforts that required the labor of entire generations, and architectural obsessions that cost more human lives than actual wars. Let me start with the most famous example of royal construction madness, the Great Pyramid of Giza, a project so massive that it essentially turned ancient Egypt into a giant construction company for over 20 years. Most people know the Great Pyramid is impressive, but they don't understand the sheer scale of human suffering that went into building it. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that constructing the Great Pyramid required approximately 100,000 workers laboring continuously for 20 years. But here's what makes this truly insane. This wasn't just a large workforce. This was essentially the entire productive population of ancient Egypt being diverted from agriculture, manufacturing, and other essential activities to build one pharaoh's tomb. Think about the economics of this decision. For 2 decades, the most advanced civilization in the ancient world stopped doing almost everything else, so they could pile up 2.3 million stone blocks into a perfect geometric shape. While neighboring civilizations were developing new technologies, expanding trade networks, and improving their citizens' lives, Egypt was moving rocks. The human cost was staggering. Construction records carved into stone show that workers died at rates that would be considered criminal negligence today. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 10,000 people died during the pyramid's construction, meaning that Pharaoh Khufu's tomb cost more lives than many military campaigns. But here's the most disturbing part. The pyramid served absolutely no practical purpose. It wasn't a temple that people could use for worship. It wasn't a palace where government business could be conducted. It wasn't infrastructure that improved anyone's life. It was literally just an elaborate grave for one person's dead body. The pyramid consumed approximately 30% of Egypt's annual economic output for 2 decades. To put that in modern terms, it would be like the United States spending $6 trillion per year for 20 years to build a single building that nobody would ever use. But if the Great Pyramid seems like an expensive grave, Versailles represents something even more economically destructive. A royal construction project that was specifically designed to bankrupt France as a display of royal power. Louis XIV didn't just want a nice palace. He wanted to build something so extravagant that it would psychologically intimidate every other European monarchy. Versailles wasn't just architecture. It was economic warfare disguised as interior decorating. The construction costs were absolutely mind-boggling. French treasury records show that Versailles consumed approximately 25% of France's entire national budget for over 50 years. That's equivalent to spending $1 trillion annually in modern terms for half a century on a single building project. But the individual details reveal the true insanity of royal excess. The famous Hall of Mirrors alone cost more than the entire annual military budget of most European countries. We're talking about a single room that was more expensive than maintaining entire armies. The gardens at Versailles required rerouting multiple rivers and destroying entire forests to create artificial landscapes that served no purpose except looking impressive. Thousands of mature trees were cut down and replanted in geometric patterns that had to be maintained by armies of gardeners working year-round. Here's the most economically destructive aspect. Versailles required a permanent workforce of over 36,000 people just for daily maintenance. These weren't temporary construction jobs. These were permanent positions for people whose only job was keeping one family's house looking perfect. Think about the opportunity cost. 36,000 skilled workers who could have been building infrastructure, developing new technologies, or creating products for export were instead employed to dust furniture and trim hedges for royal entertainment. The economic impact was catastrophic. By 1789, the cost of maintaining Versailles was consuming so much of the national budget that France couldn't afford basic government services, military defense, or famine relief. The palace that was supposed to demonstrate royal power instead demonstrated royal incompetence so dramatically that it sparked the French Revolution. But perhaps the most psychologically twisted royal construction project was King Ludwig II's Neuschwanstein Castle, a building project that reveals what happens when unlimited resources meet complete disconnection from reality. Ludwig didn't want to build a functional palace. He wanted to create a real-life fairy tale castle based on fictional stories from German mythology. This wasn't architecture. This was an attempt to make fantasy literature into physical reality using unlimited royal resources. The construction process was absolutely insane. Ludwig demanded that the castle include technological features that didn't exist yet, architectural elements that defied engineering principles, and decorative details that served no purpose except recreating scenes from operas he loved. For example, Ludwig insisted on an artificial grotto complete with a waterfall and coloured lighting system inside the castle. This wasn't just expensive interior decorating, it required diverting a mountain stream, excavating tons of rock, and installing primitive electrical systems that constantly malfunctioned. But here's where Ludwig's project becomes truly disturbing. he was spending Bavaria's entire treasury on a building he never intended to share with anyone. Neuschwanstein was designed as a private retreat where Ludwig could live alone, acting out romantic fantasies from German mythology. The castle included a medieval throne room where Ludwig would dress in costume and pretend to be a knight from Wagner operas. There was an elaborate artificial cave where he would stage personal performances of his favourite musical scenes. We're talking about a grown man using a nation's resources to build the world's most expensive private theatre for an audience of one. The construction consumed 15 years and approximately 60% of Bavaria's annual government revenue. While Bavaria's citizens struggled with poverty, inadequate infrastructure, and limited educational opportunities, their king was spending their tax money on creating a personal fantasy world. Ludwig died before the castle was completed, leaving Bavaria bankrupt and politically unstable. The project that was supposed to glorify the monarchy instead demonstrated how royal disconnection from reality could destroy entire kingdoms. Moving to an even more emotionally devastating construction project, the Taj Mahal represents romantic obsession taken to such extremes that it became a form of economic suicide. Shah Jahan didn't just want to build a beautiful tomb for his beloved wife Mumtaz. He wanted to create a structure so emotionally powerful that it would immortalize their love story forever. This wasn't just architecture. It was an attempt to turn grief into the most expensive romantic gesture in human history. The construction required over 20,000 skilled craftsmen working continuously for 22 years. But here's what makes this project economically insane. Shah Jahan demanded that every detail be absolutely perfect, regardless of cost or practicality. The famous white marble was transported over 1,000 miles from quarries in Rajasthan. The precious stones inlaid in geometric patterns were imported from across Asia and the Middle East. The calligraphy was created by the most skilled artists in the Islamic world, working for decades to complete inscriptions that most visitors would never be able to read. But the most economically destructive aspect was Shah Jahan's obsession with preventing anyone from ever building anything comparable. Historical records suggest that he deliberately disabled or killed many of the craftsmen who worked on the project to ensure that their skills couldn't be used for competing monuments. The Taj Mahal consumed approximately 40% of the Mughal Empire's treasury for over 2 decades. This was money that could have been used for military defense, infrastructure development, or economic expansion during a period when European powers were increasingly threatening Mughal territory. The political consequences were devastating. The enormous expense of the Taj Mahal left the Mughal Empire financially weakened at exactly the moment when British colonial forces were beginning their conquest of India. Shah Jahan's romantic monument may have inadvertently contributed to the fall of one of the world's greatest empires. Perhaps the most systematically oppressive royal construction project was the Forbidden City in Beijing, a complex so elaborate that it essentially turned palace construction into a form of permanent economic slavery for the Chinese people. The Forbidden City wasn't just built and then finished. It required constant reconstruction, expansion, and maintenance that consumed enormous resources for over 500 years. Chinese imperial records show that palace construction projects employed over 200,000 permanent workers whose entire lives were devoted to imperial building projects. But here's what makes the Forbidden City uniquely economically destructive. The Chinese emperors created a system where palace construction became the primary economic activity of entire regions. Provinces were required to provide specific materials, skilled craftsmen were forced to relocate permanently to Beijing, and families were separated for generations to supply labor for imperial building projects. The most psychologically disturbing aspect was the isolation principle. The Forbidden City was specifically designed to separate the emperor from any contact with ordinary Chinese life. The entire complex was built to create a completely artificial environment where the emperor would never have to see, hear, or think about the real conditions of his subjects. This wasn't just expensive architecture. It was an elaborate system for ensuring that the most powerful person in China remained completely ignorant about the country he was supposed to be governing. The economic cost was enormous, but the political cost was even greater. Chinese emperors became so isolated within their artificial palace environment that they lost all understanding of real economic conditions, military threats, and social problems. When European powers began colonizing China in the 19th century, Chinese emperors were so disconnected from reality that they couldn't comprehend the scope of the threat. The palace that was supposed to protect imperial power instead ensured imperial ignorance and vulnerability. Here's what really disturbs me about all these royal construction projects. They weren't just expensive buildings. They were symptoms of political systems that allowed individual vanity to override national welfare on a massive scale. Every one of these projects consumed resources that could have been used for infrastructure, education, military defense, or economic development. Instead, they went toward creating monuments to royal ego that provided no practical benefit to anyone except the monarchs who commissioned them. But perhaps the most chilling realization is how these construction obsessions affected royal psychology. Building projects that consumed entire national economies created a sense of godlike power that completely disconnected monarchs from normal human limitations and responsibilities. When you can command 100,000 people to spend 20 years moving rocks for your personal monument, when you can bankrupt entire kingdoms to build your private fantasy castle, when you can redirect rivers and destroy forests for your garden party space, apparently normal concepts like budget constraints and opportunity costs become meaningless. These construction projects didn't just waste resources. They created monarchs who believed that reality itself could be restructured according to their personal preferences, leading to political decision-making that was completely divorced from practical considerations. As we continue exploring royal madness, we're about to encounter something that makes even the most extravagant construction projects seem rational. Because if you think spending fortunes on useless buildings is extreme, wait until you discover the educational systems that royals created for their children. We're talking about royal upbringing so twisted, so psychologically damaging, that it systematically created monsters who were literally trained from birth to believe they were chosen by divine forces. The next stories reveal how royal education programs designed to create perfect rulers instead produce some of the most dangerous, unstable, and destructive leaders in human history. What happens when you raise a child from birth to believe they're literally chosen by God to rule over millions of people? History shows us the terrifying answer: you create monsters. I'm about to reveal 4 royal education systems so psychologically twisted, so systematically damaging, that they turned innocent children into some of the most dangerous and unstable leaders in human history. These weren't just privileged kids getting fancy tutors. These were educational programs specifically designed to create absolute rulers by destroying normal human empathy, teaching children that other people weren't really human, and convincing them that their personal desires were divine commands that must be obeyed without question. The results were exactly what you'd expect from such insane educational philosophies. Rulers who genuinely believed they could do anything to anyone without consequences, who saw mass murder as a reasonable response to minor inconveniences, and who treated the suffering of millions as entertainment. Let me start with the most systematically destructive royal education program in history: the divine right training that created absolute monarchs who literally believed they were gods walking among mortals. For over 1,000 years, European royal families used educational systems specifically designed to convince children that they were fundamentally different from other human beings. This wasn't just teaching kids that they were special. This was systematic psychological conditioning to eliminate normal human empathy and moral reasoning. Royal children were never allowed to play with common children, never witnessed the normal consequences of their actions, and never experienced any situation where their desires weren't immediately satisfied by adults whose job was to treat royal whims as divine commands. But here's where this educational system becomes truly disturbing. Royal tutors were specifically instructed to teach children that common people's suffering was irrelevant because commoners weren't fully human. Royal educational texts from medieval Europe explicitly stated that peasants, merchants, and even minor nobility were soulless vessels whose only purpose was serving royal needs. Think about the psychological impact of spending your entire childhood being taught that other people's pain doesn't matter, because they are essentially advanced animals rather than real humans like yourself. The most chilling example of this educational system's effects was Caligula, whose upbringing reveals what happens when divine right education is taken to its logical extreme. Caligula was raised in military camps where soldiers were required to treat him as a living god from the age of 3. He never had a normal conversation with another child, never experienced disappointment or frustration, and never encountered any adult who wasn't required to obey his every command instantly. Roman historians document that Caligula's education included watching executions as entertainment, participating in mock battles where real prisoners were killed for his amusement, and being encouraged to order punishments for servants who displeased him in minor ways. By the time Caligula became emperor, he genuinely couldn't understand why other people's deaths should concern him any more than stepping on insects. His education had so completely eliminated normal human empathy that he saw mass murder as a reasonable solution to boredom. Historical records show that Caligula would order executions during dinner parties because he enjoyed watching people die while he ate. He once had an entire section of arena audience fed to wild animals because they cheered for the wrong gladiator. These weren't acts of political calculation. They were the behavior of someone whose education had made normal human emotions impossible. But perhaps even more psychologically destructive was Louis XIV's isolation education, which created what might be history's most successful narcissist. Louis was deliberately isolated from normal human contact from birth. His education was specifically designed to ensure that he never experienced any situation where he wasn't the absolute center of attention and adoration. Louis's daily routine included formal ceremonies where dozens of nobles competed for the privilege of performing basic services like helping him get dressed. But this wasn't just royal protocol. It was systematic psychological conditioning designed to convince Louis that other people existed solely to serve his needs. French court records describe educational sessions where Louis was taught that his personal comfort was more important than the survival of entire regions of France. When famines occurred, Louis's tutors would explain that peasant suffering was necessary to maintain the cosmic order that placed him at the center of the universe. The psychological effects were devastating. Louis genuinely believed that reality itself should conform to his personal preferences. When presented with military defeats, economic problems, or social unrest, Louis would become confused and angry that the universe wasn't organizing itself according to his desires. But here's the most chilling aspect of Louis's education. It worked exactly as intended. Louis successfully maintained absolute power for 72 years by creating a political system where everyone else was required to participate in maintaining his delusions of cosmic importance. The educational system that created Louis wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate strategy for producing rulers who would never doubt their right to unlimited power over other people's lives. Moving to a different but equally disturbing educational approach, the Chinese imperial education system reveals what happens when royal children are taught that their personal emotions are literally forces of nature that reshape reality. Chinese princes weren't just taught that they were superior to other people. They were educated to believe that their moods and feelings had supernatural power that could affect weather, harvests, and cosmic harmony. When a royal child felt angry, tutors would explain that this anger was a divine force that needed to be expressed through punishment of whoever had caused the displeasure. When a prince felt happy, this was interpreted as cosmic approval that needed to be celebrated through elaborate ceremonies involving hundreds of people. Chinese imperial educational texts describe training programs where royal children were encouraged to see their emotional states as natural disasters that other people needed to accommodate. A prince's sadness might require court-wide mourning periods, while royal excitement could mandate days-long festivals involving thousands of participants. The psychological conditioning was so thorough that Chinese emperors genuinely believed their personal feelings were more important than objective reality. When military campaigns failed or economic policies caused disasters, emperors would blame the problems on other people's failure to properly support the royal emotional state, rather than examining their own decision-making. But perhaps the most systematically evil royal education program belonged to certain Roman imperial families who specifically trained their children to enjoy inflicting pain on other people. Some Roman princes were educated using training programs that specifically included torturing animals, watching executions, and participating in gladiatorial games as preparation for imperial leadership. This wasn't accidental exposure to violence. This was systematic conditioning designed to create rulers who would find cruelty emotionally satisfying. Educational records describe training sessions where royal children were rewarded for showing creativity in designing punishments for condemned prisoners. Princes competed to invent new forms of execution and torture, with tutors praising the most innovative displays of cruelty as evidence of imperial intelligence and leadership potential. The logic was that future emperors needed to be comfortable with violence and death, so educational programs deliberately eliminated normal human revulsion toward causing suffering. Royal children were taught to see cruelty as a useful political tool and personal entertainment option. The results were exactly what you'd expect. Emperors who genuinely enjoyed mass murder, who organized elaborate torture events as public entertainment, and who saw the suffering of their subjects as proof of their own power and importance. But here's what's truly terrifying about all these royal education systems. They weren't accidental failures or products of primitive understanding. They were deliberately designed psychological conditioning programs created by intelligent people who understood exactly what they were doing. Royal educators knew that normal human empathy and moral reasoning would make absolute rule psychologically impossible. So they systematically destroyed these characteristics in royal children, replacing them with narcissism, cruelty, and disconnection from reality. These educational programs weren't trying to create good leaders. They were trying to create people who could exercise unlimited power without being bothered by guilt, empathy, or moral considerations. The most chilling realization is that these educational systems worked exactly as intended. They successfully produced rulers who could order mass executions without emotional distress, who could cause enormous suffering without psychological conflict, and who could maintain absolute power without being limited by normal human conscience. But the long-term consequences were catastrophic. Societies ruled by people with systematically destroyed empathy inevitably became unstable, violent, and ultimately self-destructive. The educational systems that were designed to create perfect absolute rulers instead created the conditions for political collapse, social disintegration, and civilizational decline. Modern royal families have largely abandoned these psychologically destructive educational approaches, but the historical examples serve as terrifying reminders of what happens when power becomes more important than humanity. When you systematically train children to believe that other people's suffering doesn't matter, that their personal desires are cosmic commands, and that cruelty is an appropriate response to inconvenience, you don't create great leaders. You create dangerous sociopaths with unlimited resources and legal authority to act on their worst impulses. It makes you wonder how many historical disasters, wars, and atrocities can be traced directly to educational systems that deliberately destroyed normal human moral development in the people who held the most power over other people's lives. As we delve deeper into the darkest corners of royal behavior, we're about to explore something that makes even the most twisted educational systems seem almost reasonable. Because if you think training children to be narcissistic sociopaths is extreme, wait until you discover the military strategies that royals considered brilliant tactical innovations. We're talking about battle plans so insane, so counterintuitive, and so apparently suicidal that they should have resulted in immediate defeat. Except somehow, against all logic and military science, these crazy strategies actually worked. The next stories involve kings who won major wars by doing exactly the opposite of what any reasonable military commander would do. Sometimes the most brilliant military strategies are the ones that sound completely insane. Throughout history, certain kings achieved legendary victories by doing exactly the opposite of what any reasonable military commander would do. I'm about to share 3 royal military strategies so crazy, so counterintuitive, and so apparently suicidal that they should have resulted in immediate catastrophic defeat. Except somehow, against all logic and conventional military wisdom, these insane tactics actually worked. These weren't just lucky accidents or desperate gambles that happened to pay off. These were calculated strategies based on psychological warfare, unconventional thinking, and a deep understanding of human nature that was centuries ahead of traditional military science. The first story involves a king who literally threw money at his enemies as a weapon of war, and it worked better than any sword or cannon ever could. Picture this. It's 336 BC, and Philip II of Macedon is facing a massive coalition of Greek city-states determined to stop his expansion. His army is outnumbered 3-1, his supply lines are stretched thin, and conventional military wisdom says he should retreat immediately and negotiate a peace treaty. Instead, Philip does something that his own generals think is complete madness. He empties his treasury and starts bribing enemy soldiers to switch sides, not secretly or gradually, but openly and dramatically during active military campaigns. But here's where Philip's strategy becomes truly genius. He wasn't just buying individual soldiers, he was buying entire military units, complete command structures, and even enemy generals. We're talking about a systematic approach to warfare that treated money as a more effective weapon than violence. Greek historical records document Philip's gold warfare in incredible detail. He would send representatives to enemy camps carrying chests full of gold coins, openly announcing that any soldier who joined the Macedonian army would receive immediate payment equal to 5 years of military wages. The psychological effect was devastating. Enemy armies would literally watch their own soldiers defect in real time as Philip's agents distributed wealth more lavishly than most soldiers had ever seen in their entire lives. But Philip's true genius was understanding that military loyalty is ultimately an economic relationship. Soldiers fight for whoever pays them, and Philip was willing to pay more than anyone else in the ancient world. The results were extraordinary. In the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, Philip defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes not through superior tactics or better weapons, but because approximately 40% of the enemy army had already been bribed to switch sides before the battle even began. Greek historians recorded that the battle was essentially over before it started, because Philip had spent 2 years systematically purchasing enemy military units until his opponent's armies existed more on paper than in reality. But here's the most brilliant aspect of Philip's strategy. It was actually more cost-effective than traditional warfare. The gold he spent bribing enemies cost less than the equipment, supplies, and casualties that would have resulted from conventional military campaigns. Philip essentially discovered that buying armies was cheaper than fighting them, a realization that changed the nature of ancient warfare permanently. But if Philip's gold strategy seems clever, Alexander the Great's psychological warfare tactics reveal an even more sophisticated understanding of how to win battles without actually fighting them. Alexander didn't just conquer most of the known world through military superiority. He conquered it through reputation management and psychological intimidation that made actual battles unnecessary most of the time. Here's what most people don't understand about Alexander's conquests. He won the majority of his victories before his enemies ever saw his army. Alexander had developed a system of psychological warfare so effective that cities would surrender just upon hearing that he was approaching. The strategy was based on a carefully cultivated reputation for being absolutely ruthless toward enemies who resisted, but remarkably generous toward those who surrendered immediately. Alexander would deliberately make examples of cities that opposed him, ensuring that the stories of these destructions spread faster than his actual army. But the genius was in the details. When Alexander destroyed Thebes in 335 BC, he didn't just defeat the city. He orchestrated the destruction as a piece of psychological theatre designed to terrify every other city in the region. Historical accounts describe how Alexander sold the entire population of Thebes into slavery, razed every building except temples and the house of the poet Pindar, and left the ruins as a permanent monument to what happened to cities that opposed him. But here's the brilliant part. Alexander made sure that survivors from Thebes were deliberately allowed to escape so they could spread first-hand accounts of the destruction throughout Greece and beyond. Within months, stories of Thebes' fate had reached every major city from Egypt to India. Alexander had essentially created the ancient world's first viral marketing campaign, except instead of selling products, he was selling surrender. The psychological impact was so powerful that when Alexander's army approached other cities, local populations would often force their own leaders to surrender rather than risk experiencing Thebes' fate. Persian historical records show that entire regions would submit to Alexander's authority weeks before his army actually arrived, simply because messengers had brought news of his approach, along with detailed stories of what happened to cities that resisted. Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire required remarkably few actual battles, because his reputation had made most resistance seem psychologically impossible. But perhaps the most counterintuitive military strategy in history was employed by certain Chinese generals, who discovered that deliberately appearing weak and incompetent could be more effective than displaying actual military strength. The strategy, known as feigned incompetence, involved convincing enemies that your army was poorly led, badly equipped, and strategically confused, encouraging them to attack in circumstances that were actually carefully designed traps. The most famous example was General Han Xin's campaign against the Zhao army in 204 BC. Han Xin deliberately positioned his forces in a tactically impossible situation, with a river behind them and no apparent retreat route, violating every principle of conventional military strategy. But this wasn't incompetence. It was calculated psychological manipulation. Han Xin understood that his enemies would interpret the poor positioning as evidence that he was a terrible general leading a demoralized army, encouraging them to attack aggressively rather than carefully. Chinese military records describe how Han Xin's army appeared to be in complete disarray, with soldiers seemingly confused about their orders, equipment scattered randomly, and command structures that looked chaotic and ineffective. The Zhao generals were so convinced that they were facing an incompetent opponent that they abandoned their own careful defensive strategies and launched an immediate full-scale attack, expecting an easy victory against a disorganized enemy. But Han Xin had secretly prepared his forces for exactly this scenario. What appeared to be chaos was actually a sophisticated tactical formation designed to absorb and redirect enemy attacks. The river that seemed like a disadvantage was actually a strategic barrier that prevented retreat, forcing Han Xin's soldiers to fight with desperate intensity. The psychological effect on Han Xin's own troops was crucial. Knowing they had no retreat option, they fought with a ferocity that surprised their enemies and compensated for their apparent tactical disadvantage. The battle was a complete rout. The Zhao army, expecting to face disorganized opposition, instead encountered desperate fighters in carefully prepared positions. The victory was so decisive that it established Han Xin as one of history's greatest military strategists, but the most brilliant aspect of this strategy was its reusability. Once Han Xin had established a reputation for feigned incompetence, other enemies would repeatedly fall for similar tactics, assuming that his previous victories were just lucky accidents rather than calculated strategies. Here's what makes these royal military strategies so fascinating. They all succeeded because they understood something fundamental about human psychology that conventional military thinking had missed. Philip's gold strategy worked because it recognized that military loyalty is ultimately an economic calculation, and that buying soldiers is often more efficient than fighting them. Alexander's reputation warfare succeeded because it understood that fear is more powerful than force, and that psychological intimidation can achieve results that physical violence cannot. Han Xin's feigned incompetence strategy was effective because it exploited the natural human tendency to underestimate opponents who appear weak, turning overconfidence into a tactical vulnerability. All three of these approaches succeeded because they focused on manipulating enemy decision-making rather than simply trying to overpower enemy forces through superior numbers or equipment. But perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is that the most effective strategies often involve doing exactly the opposite of what conventional wisdom suggests. When everyone expects military leaders to conserve resources, sometimes the winning move is to spend lavishly. When conventional tactics emphasize appearing strong, sometimes the smartest approach is to appear weak. When traditional strategy focuses on defeating enemies, sometimes the best option is to purchase them instead. These royal military innovations succeeded because they rejected conventional thinking and instead focused on understanding the psychological and economic factors that actually determine military outcomes. Modern military strategists still study these ancient examples because they demonstrate timeless principles about human nature, decision-making, and the psychology of conflict that remain relevant regardless of technological changes. But as impressive as these military strategies were, they pale in comparison to what we're about to explore next. Because if you think unconventional warfare is extreme, wait until you discover the economic decisions that royals made throughout history. We're talking about financial choices so bizarre, so economically destructive, and so completely contrary to basic economic principles that they accidentally created the financial systems we still use today. The next stories involve monarchs who made such catastrophically bad economic decisions that they inadvertently invented modern banking, international trade, and even paper currency, all while trying to do something completely different. Here's one of history's greatest ironies. Some of the most important economic innovations that we still use today were created by complete accident when monarchs made catastrophically bad financial decisions. I'm about to reveal 5 royal economic disasters so monumentally stupid that they accidentally invented modern banking, international trade, and even the paper money in your wallet. These weren't brilliant economic strategists who carefully planned revolutionary financial systems. These were kings and queens who made such spectacularly terrible decisions that they broke existing economic systems so completely that entirely new ones had to be created just to deal with the mess they'd made. Let me start with the most economically significant royal disaster in history. How King William III's desperate need for war funding accidentally created the Bank of England and modern central banking. In 1694, William was facing a financial crisis that would have destroyed most monarchies. He needed to finance ongoing wars against France, but England's treasury was completely empty. The kingdom's credit was ruined from previous royal spending disasters, and traditional methods of raising money had all been exhausted. So William did something that seemed absolutely insane at the time. He borrowed money from private citizens and promised to pay them back with interest, using the government's future tax revenue as collateral. This wasn't just a loan. It was essentially selling shares in the kingdom's financial future to whoever was willing to buy them. But here's where William's desperation created accidental genius. To manage this unprecedented debt arrangement, he authorized the creation of the Bank of England, giving a private corporation the authority to issue currency, manage government debt, and essentially function as the kingdom's financial administrator. The Bank of England charter was literally written by people who were making up financial concepts as they went along, trying to solve William's immediate cash crisis without understanding that they were creating the blueprint for every central banking system that would ever exist. British financial records show that William borrowed $1.2 million through this new system, equivalent to approximately $200 million today. But more importantly, he established the principle that governments could finance operations by selling debt to private investors, creating a market for government bonds that became the foundation of modern international finance. The irony is staggering. William was just trying to pay for his wars without raising taxes that might provoke domestic rebellion. He accidentally created a financial system so sophisticated that it's still used by every major economy in the world over 300 years later. But if William's banking innovation was accidental, the Spanish Empire's approach to international trade was so economically destructive that it accidentally created the global economic principles we still follow today. When Spanish conquistadors began shipping massive quantities of silver from the New World, Spanish royalty thought they had solved all economic problems forever. They believed that having more precious metals automatically made their kingdom richer and more powerful than any other nation. But here's where Spanish economic ignorance created one of history's most important lessons about inflation and currency valuation. Flooding European markets with cheap silver didn't make Spain richer. It made Spanish money worthless. Spanish financial records from the 16th century document the most spectacular currency collapse in pre-modern history. Between 1550 and 1650, Spanish silver was so abundant that its purchasing power decreased by approximately 80%. Spanish coins that could once buy a week's worth of food became barely sufficient for a single meal. But the Spanish court couldn't understand why having more silver was making them poorer. They kept importing larger quantities of precious metals, expecting that more wealth would solve their economic problems, while actually making the situation worse with each new shipment. The economic consequences were catastrophic for Spain, but revolutionary for the rest of the world. Other European nations learned that currency value depends on scarcity rather than absolute quantity, leading to modern understanding of monetary policy, inflation control, and international exchange rates. Spanish silver flooding European markets accidentally created the first truly international economy, forcing different nations to develop sophisticated financial relationships based on relative currency values, rather than simple gold and silver weight. The Spanish Empire's economic incompetence essentially taught the world how modern international trade should work, by demonstrating exactly what not to do with monetary policy. But perhaps the most accidentally revolutionary royal economic decision was made by Chinese emperors, who tried to solve a paper shortage by creating the world's first government-issued currency. During the Song dynasty in the 11th century, Chinese merchants were using so much paper for IOUs and trade receipts that the empire was facing a severe paper shortage. Rather than increasing paper production or regulating merchant activities, Emperor Zhenzong decided to solve the problem by having the government take over all paper-based financial transactions. This wasn't an attempt to create a new monetary system, it was basically the emperor trying to control office supplies. But the result was the first government-issued paper currency in human history. Chinese economic records show that the initial paper money was literally just government IOUs that promised to exchange the paper for real money, silver or gold, at some future date. The emperor was essentially asking people to accept paper promises instead of actual valuable materials. But here's where the Chinese accidentally discovered something that would revolutionize global economics. People were willing to trade paper promises as if they were real money, as long as they trusted the government to honor those promises eventually. Within decades, Chinese paper currency was being used for major commercial transactions, international trade, and even tax payments. The Song dynasty had accidentally created the concept of fiat currency, money that has value because the government says it has value, rather than because it's made from precious materials. The psychological breakthrough was enormous. For the first time in human history, people were comfortable using money that was valuable only because everyone agreed it was valuable, rather than because it was made from gold or silver that had intrinsic worth. Modern paper currency, credit cards, and digital banking all trace their origins back to a Chinese emperor who was just trying to save paper and accidentally discovered that money is fundamentally a shared psychological agreement rather than a physical commodity. Moving to another accidental economic innovation, royal colonization charters created the legal and financial foundations for modern corporate structure without anyone understanding what they were doing. When European monarchs started granting exclusive trading rights to colonial companies like the British East India Company or the Dutch West India Company, they thought they were just creating efficient ways to extract wealth from overseas territories. But the legal structures required to manage these colonial enterprises accidentally created the concept of the modern corporation. Colonial charters had to define how private investors could pool resources, share profits and losses, and maintain ongoing business operations across multiple generations and geographical regions. The British East India Company Charter, granted in 1600, accidentally established principles of limited liability, shareholder ownership, and corporate governance that became the template for every major business organization that followed. But here's the really wild part. The monarchs who granted these charters had no idea they were creating legal entities that would eventually become more powerful than governments themselves. The East India Company eventually controlled more territory and commanded larger armies than most European kingdoms, all based on legal structures that were originally designed just to facilitate trade in exotic spices and textiles. Colonial charter companies accidentally proved that private organizations with proper legal frameworks could accomplish economic and political objectives that traditional government structures couldn't achieve, leading directly to modern capitalism and corporate-dominated global economics. Perhaps the most economically significant royal accident was the creation of international banking through medieval royal debt crises. During the 13th and 14th centuries, European monarchs were constantly borrowing money from Italian banking families to finance wars, construction projects, and general royal lifestyle maintenance. But royal debt management was so chaotic that kings regularly defaulted on loans, died before repaying debts, or simply refused to honor financial agreements when convenient. Italian bankers developed increasingly sophisticated financial instruments to protect themselves from royal irresponsibility. Letters of credit, international currency exchange, loan syndication among multiple banks, and complex insurance arrangements that could survive political upheavals. The Medici family's banking innovations, created specifically to deal with unreliable royal customers, accidentally established the foundations of modern international finance. Their systems for managing currency exchange, international trade financing, and multinational business operations became the template for every major financial institution that followed. Here's what's truly remarkable about all these royal economic accidents. They succeeded because they solved real economic problems, even though the monarchs who created them had no understanding of the problems they were solving. William's banking innovation worked because it created a systematic way to manage government debt and monetary policy. Spanish silver policy taught the world about inflation and currency management through negative example. Chinese paper money succeeded because it discovered that trust and psychological agreement are more important than physical materials for currency function. These accidental innovations persist today because they addressed fundamental economic realities that remain constant regardless of technological changes. Modern central banks, international trade agreements, paper currency, and corporate structures all trace their origins to royal economic disasters that accidentally discovered timeless principles about how human economic behavior actually works. But perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is that major economic innovations often come from desperate attempts to solve immediate practical problems rather than from abstract theoretical planning. The economic systems we use today weren't designed by brilliant economists who carefully considered all possible outcomes. They were created by people who were just trying to fix immediate crises and accidentally stumbled onto solutions that worked better than anyone expected. But as fascinating as these accidental economic innovations were, they pale in comparison to what we're about to explore next. Because if you think creating modern banking by accident is impressive, wait until you discover the scientific obsessions that consumed royal minds for centuries. We're talking about kings and queens who funded experiments so bizarre, so seemingly impossible, that they sound like science fiction. Except some of these royal science projects actually worked and laid the foundations for technologies we still use today. The next stories involve monarchs who were so obsessed with turning lead into gold, predicting the future, and achieving immortality that they accidentally invented chemistry, astronomy, and modern medicine. Long before modern laboratories existed, royal courts became the world's first research institutions, funded by monarchs obsessed with impossible dreams that sound like pure fantasy. I'm about to reveal 4 royal scientific obsessions so bizarre, so seemingly ridiculous, that they appear to be medieval science fiction. Except these crazy experiments accidentally laid the foundations for chemistry, astronomy, medicine, and technologies we still use today. These weren't just wealthy people with eccentric hobbies. These were systematic research programs that consumed enormous resources, employed the brightest minds of their time, and pursued goals so ambitious that they seemed completely impossible. The irony is that while these royal scientists never achieved their original impossible objectives, their failures led to discoveries that changed the world forever. Let me start with the most famous and economically destructive royal scientific obsession in history. This centuries-long quest to turn ordinary metals into gold through alchemy. For over 1,000 years, European monarchs spent fortunes funding alchemical research, convinced that discovering the philosopher's stone would solve all economic problems by allowing unlimited gold production. This wasn't just casual interest. This was systematic scientific investment that consumed significant portions of royal treasuries across multiple centuries. King Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire spent approximately 40% of his annual budget on alchemical experiments between 1576 and 1612. We're talking about a 36-year research program that cost more than most kingdoms spent on their entire military forces, Rudolph's court alchemists included some of the most brilliant minds in Europe: mathematicians, physicians, natural philosophers, and experimental researchers who were essentially conducting the world's first systematic chemistry experiments, even though they thought they were trying to create magical transformations. But here's where royal alchemy becomes accidentally revolutionary. These alchemists couldn't turn lead into gold, but they discovered fundamental principles of chemical reactions, metallurgy, an experimental method that became the foundation of modern chemistry. Alchemical laboratory records from Rudolph's court document the discovery of new chemical compounds, innovative experimental techniques, and systematic approaches to studying material properties that were centuries ahead of their time. For example, royal alchemists developed distillation processes that are still used in modern chemical manufacturing. They created the first systematic classification of chemical substances and invented laboratory equipment that remained standard in scientific research for over 400 years. The most important breakthrough was the development of experimental method itself. The idea that natural phenomena could be understood through systematic testing rather than just theoretical speculation. Royal alchemists never created gold, but they accidentally created the scientific method, establishing principles of controlled experimentation, systematic observation, and reproducible results that became the foundation of all modern scientific research. But if alchemy was economically expensive, royal astronomical obsessions reveal how impossible scientific goals can accidentally lead to practical technological revolutions. Medieval and Renaissance monarchs were convinced that understanding celestial movements would allow them to predict the future, control political events, and gain supernatural advantages over their enemies. Royal courts employed teams of astronomers whose job was essentially creating magical forecasting systems based on planetary positions. But to make accurate astrological predictions, these court astronomers needed to develop incredibly precise techniques for observing and calculating celestial movements. This practical requirement accidentally led to revolutionary advances in mathematics, optics, and engineering. Emperor Rudolph II's court astronomer, Tycho Brahe, built the most sophisticated astronomical observatory in pre-telescope history, creating instruments so precise that his measurements of planetary positions remained the most accurate available for over 200 years. But Brahe wasn't trying to advance scientific knowledge. He was trying to create more accurate horoscopes for the emperor and better astrological guidance for royal decision-making. The irony is extraordinary. Brahe's attempts to improve royal fortune-telling accidentally produced the most precise astronomical data in human history, which Johannes Kepler later used to discover the laws of planetary motion that became the foundation of modern physics and space exploration. Royal investment in astrological research accidentally created the mathematical and observational foundations for every astronomical achievement that followed, from Newton's laws to modern space travel. Chinese emperors took astronomical research even further, creating the most sophisticated calendar systems and astronomical observations in the ancient world, all because they believed that royal authority depended on perfectly predicting seasonal changes and celestial events. Chinese imperial astronomical programs employed thousands of researchers and consumed enormous resources for over 2,000 years, producing astronomical calculations so accurate that they weren't improved upon until the invention of electronic computers. But these astronomical achievements were motivated entirely by the belief that emperors needed supernatural control over natural cycles to maintain political legitimacy. The emperors thought they were conducting magical research. They were actually creating the mathematical foundations of modern astronomy and calendar science. Moving to an even more impossible royal scientific obsession, the quest for immortality led to medical experiments so dangerous and bizarre that they accidentally advanced human understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical technique. Chinese emperors spent fortunes funding research into elixirs of immortality, employing teams of physicians and alchemists to develop substances that would prevent death and aging. These experiments involved testing thousands of different chemical compounds, mineral mixtures, and biological preparations on human subjects. Emperor Qin Shi Huang spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars funding immortality research, creating what was essentially the world's first systematic pharmaceutical testing program. But here's the accidentally brilliant part. Testing potential immortality drugs required imperial physicians to develop sophisticated understanding of human physiology, drug interactions, and medical diagnosis. Chinese medical texts from imperial immortality research document anatomical discoveries, surgical techniques, and pharmaceutical knowledge that were centuries ahead of medical practice in the rest of the world. For example, imperial physicians developed acupuncture, herbal medicine systems, and surgical procedures that are still used in modern medicine, all because they were trying to create magical life extension treatments for emperors. The most important accidental discovery was the development of systematic medical testing and documentation. Imperial immortality research established principles of clinical observation, dose-response testing, and medical record-keeping that became the foundation of evidence-based medicine. Royal physicians never achieved immortality, but they accidentally created comprehensive medical knowledge that extended human lifespan and improved health outcomes for centuries. European monarchs pursued similar immortality research through different approaches, funding medical experiments that accidentally advanced surgical technique, anatomical knowledge, and pharmaceutical development. King Charles II's royal physicians conducted experimental surgeries, chemical treatments, and anatomical research that pushed the boundaries of medical knowledge, all in pursuit of the impossible goal of preventing royal aging and death. But perhaps the most accidentally successful royal scientific obsession involved collecting curiosities from around the world, creating the first systematic natural history research programs. Renaissance monarchs competed to create the most impressive cabinets of curiosities, collections of exotic animals, unusual plants, strange minerals, and bizarre artifacts from distant lands. These collections were designed as displays of royal wealth and sophistication rather than scientific research tools. But maintaining these collections required developing systematic approaches to specimen preservation, classification, and study that accidentally created the foundations of modern natural science. Royal curiosity collections employed naturalists, botanists, zoologists, and researchers who developed the first comprehensive systems for studying and cataloguing natural phenomena. The British Royal Collection, French Cabinet du Roi, and similar royal natural history programs accidentally established the classification systems, preservation techniques, and research methods that became the foundation of modern biology, geology, and anthropology. Royal collectors weren't trying to advance scientific knowledge. They were trying to impress visitors with exotic displays of wealth and power. But their competitive collecting accidentally created the world's first comprehensive natural science research institutions. Here's what's truly remarkable about all these royal scientific obsessions. They succeeded in advancing human knowledge precisely because they were motivated by impossible goals that required systematic investigation and experimentation. Royal alchemists advanced chemistry while trying to create gold. Royal astronomers advanced mathematics and physics while trying to predict the future. Royal physicians advanced medicine while trying to achieve immortality. Royal collectors advanced natural science while trying to display wealth. The impossible goals forced royal researchers to develop new experimental methods, systematic observation techniques, and rigorous documentation practices that accidentally created the foundations of modern scientific research. But perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is that major scientific breakthroughs often come from pursuing goals that seem completely impossible. because impossible objectives force researchers to develop innovative approaches that wouldn't be necessary for more reasonable goals. The scientific method itself was essentially created by people who were trying to accomplish magical transformations, and discovered that systematic experimentation was more effective than wishful thinking or theoretical speculation. Modern science owes more to royal obsessions with impossible dreams than to any other single source, because these obsessions provided the resources, motivation, and institutional support necessary for systematic research during periods when such investigation would otherwise have been impossible. As we approach the final chapter of our journey through royal madness, we're about to discover the most important lessons that these bizarre historical stories can teach us about leadership, power, and human nature in the modern world. Because after exploring 49 of the weirdest royal facts in history, certain patterns emerge that reveal timeless truths about what happens when individuals are given unlimited authority over other people's lives. The next and final section will synthesize everything we've learned about royal behavior into 3 crucial lessons that every modern leader, whether in politics, business, or any other field, desperately needs to understand if they want to avoid repeating the catastrophic mistakes that destroyed the most powerful people in human history. After exploring 49 of the weirdest royal facts in human history, from deadly beauty routines to pet palaces worth more than entire kingdoms, certain patterns emerge that reveal profound truths about power, leadership, and human nature. Tonight, as we conclude this extraordinary journey through royal madness, I want to share 3 crucial lessons that every modern leader desperately needs to understand if they want to avoid repeating the catastrophic mistakes that destroyed the most powerful people in history. These aren't just historical curiosities or entertaining stories about eccentric monarchs. These are warnings about what happens when unlimited power meets human psychology. Lessons that remain terrifyingly relevant in our modern world of corporate executives, political leaders, and anyone who finds themselves in positions of authority over other people's lives. The first and most important lesson is what I call the isolation trap. How power systematically separates leaders from the reality they're supposed to be managing. Throughout our journey tonight, we've seen this pattern repeated across every culture and time period. Elizabeth I poisoning herself with lead makeup because she couldn't bear to show human vulnerability. Louis XIV requiring 100 courtiers to protect him from imaginary supernatural threats. Chinese emperors living in forbidden cities designed to ensure they never encountered ordinary human experience. But this wasn't just royal eccentricity. This was the inevitable result of political systems that treated leaders as fundamentally different from other human beings. Think about the psychological impact of spending your entire life surrounded only by people whose job is to agree with you, serve your needs, and never challenge your decisions. When every conversation is filtered through political calculation, when every relationship exists primarily to benefit you, when every environment is carefully constructed to make you comfortable, how can you possibly understand the real world that exists outside that bubble? Modern research in organizational psychology has documented exactly this phenomenon in contemporary leadership. Studies show that executives who spend too much time isolated in leadership hierarchies develop what researchers call CEO syndrome, a gradual disconnection from operational reality that leads to increasingly poor decision-making. The royal examples we've explored tonight represent the most extreme versions of this isolation effect, but the underlying psychological mechanisms are identical to what happens in modern corporations, political organizations, and any institutional structure that separates leaders from direct contact with the people affected by their decisions. Marie Antoinette genuinely couldn't understand why people were upset about her dress expenses, because she lived in an environment where enormous spending on personal luxury was completely normal. Her isolation wasn't just physical, it was psychological and economic, preventing her from comprehending how her choices affected other people's lives. The most chilling modern parallel is how contemporary leaders can make decisions affecting millions of people while remaining completely isolated from the consequences of those decisions. When you travel in private jets, live in gated communities, and work in environments where everyone treats you as inherently special, how can you possibly make good decisions about policies that affect ordinary people? The solution isn't to eliminate leadership hierarchies, it's to create systems that prevent leaders from becoming completely disconnected from the reality they're supposed to be managing. The most successful modern leaders are those who actively work to maintain contact with operational reality, who seek out perspectives that challenge their assumptions, and who resist the natural tendency for power to create isolation. The second crucial lesson is the succession problem. How concentrating power in individual personalities creates systemic instability that destroys institutions across generations. Royal families throughout history struggled with a fundamental contradiction. They needed to concentrate enormous power in single individuals to maintain authority. But concentrating power in individuals makes that power impossible to transfer effectively to the next generation. We've seen this pattern repeatedly tonight. Henry VIII's obsession with male succession led to decades of political instability and religious warfare. Chinese dynastic succession crises regularly destroyed centuries of accumulated political and economic development. European royal families created elaborate succession laws that still led to constant warfare over inheritance rights. But the deeper problem wasn't just legal complexity, it was the psychological impossibility of preparing someone to inherit absolute power. How do you train a child to exercise unlimited authority responsibly when that training process itself requires giving them experiences that normal human development makes psychologically damaging? How do you prepare someone for ultimate responsibility while protecting them from the experiences that would teach them humility, empathy, and realistic judgment? The royal education systems we explored tonight represent systematic attempts to solve this impossible challenge, and they consistently failed because the problem is fundamentally unsolvable. You can't create healthy human beings by raising them to believe they're fundamentally superior to other people, but you also can't maintain absolute power structures without creating that sense of superiority. Modern leadership faces similar succession challenges, though usually on smaller scales. Family businesses struggle to transfer leadership across generations. Political movements often collapse when charismatic founders try to pass authority to chosen successors. Corporate cultures built around individual leaders frequently disintegrate when those leaders leave. The most successful modern institutions are those that have learned from royal succession failures by distributing power across multiple people and systems, creating leadership structures that can survive individual personalities rather than depending on them. But perhaps the most important lesson from royal succession disasters is understanding that sustainable leadership requires building systems that are stronger than individual leaders, rather than creating institutions that depend entirely on finding exceptional individuals to maintain them. The third and most profound lesson is the public perception paradox. How the image management required to maintain power often destroys the authenticity that makes leadership effective. Throughout our exploration tonight, we've seen monarchs who became so obsessed with maintaining royal appearance that they lost touch with the substance of leadership. Catherine the Great's strategic approach to romance that turned personal relationships into political theatre. Louis XIV's surveillance state that made genuine human connection impossible. The elaborate royal protocols that turned everyday activities into staged performances. These weren't just personal choices, they were systematic approaches to power that prioritized perception over reality, image over authenticity, and political effect over human connection. But here's the paradox. The more energy leaders put into managing their image, the less authentic they become, and the less authentic they become, the more they need to rely on image management rather than actual competence and genuine relationship building. We've seen this cycle destroy royal families across centuries and continents. Monarchs became so focused on appearing divine, infallible, and superior that they lost the ability to acknowledge mistakes, learn from failures, or adapt to changing circumstances. Modern leadership faces identical challenges in our media-saturated, social media-driven environment. Political leaders, corporate executives, and public figures often become so focused on messaging, branding, and image control that they lose the authentic connection with reality that effective leadership requires. The royal examples we've explored tonight serve as extreme warnings about what happens when image management becomes more important than actual competence. When appearance matters more than substance, when perception becomes more important than reality, when maintaining the illusion of perfection becomes more crucial than actually solving problems. The most effective modern leaders are those who have learned to balance necessary image management with authentic engagement, who understand that long-term credibility depends more on honest competence than on perfect presentation. But perhaps the most important insight from studying royal image management disasters is understanding that authenticity isn't just a moral choice. It's a practical necessity for sustainable leadership effectiveness. As we reflect on these lessons, it's worth considering how they apply to our own lives and the leaders we encounter in our modern world. When we see political leaders who seem disconnected from ordinary experience, we're witnessing the isolation trap in action. When we observe organizations struggling with leadership transitions, we're seeing the succession problem play out in real time. When we notice leaders who seem more focused on their public image than on actual results, we're watching the public perception paradox unfold. But understanding these patterns also helps us become better followers, citizens and participants in the institutions that shape our lives. We can recognize warning signs of dysfunctional leadership, support systems that promote healthy power distribution, and resist the tendency to create the same kinds of hero worship that led to royal excess throughout history. The 49 weird royal facts we've explored tonight aren't just entertaining historical oddities. They're case studies in human nature under extreme conditions, experiments in what happens when normal social constraints are removed from individual behavior. These stories matter because they reveal timeless truths about power, leadership, and human psychology that remain relevant regardless of technological changes or social evolution. The same psychological mechanisms that led ancient pharaohs to build pyramids with slave labor, medieval kings to poison themselves with lead makeup, and Renaissance monarchs to spend fortunes on impossible alchemical experiments continue to influence modern leadership behavior in politics, business, and every other sphere of human organization. But perhaps the most important takeaway from tonight's journey is hope. Because while these royal examples represent failures of leadership, they also demonstrate human resilience, creativity, and the capacity for learning from mistakes. Many of the greatest advances in human civilization came from royal disasters that forced societies to develop better systems. The French Revolution emerged from royal financial incompetence, but led to modern democratic principles. Royal scientific obsessions with impossible goals accidentally created the foundations of modern research. Even royal spy networks, despite their oppressive intentions, developed organizational techniques that improved administrative efficiency. Human societies have consistently learned from leadership failures and developed better approaches to power, authority, and collective decision-making. The constitutional monarchies, democratic institutions, and corporate governance systems that we use today all represent attempts to solve the problems that destroyed unlimited royal authority throughout history. As we close this extraordinary night of royal revelations, I want to thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey through the weird, wonderful, and often disturbing world of historical royal behaviour. These stories remind us that even the most powerful people in history were fundamentally human, subject to the same psychological limitations, emotional needs, and moral challenges that we all face. But they also remind us of our responsibility to learn from the past, to support leadership systems that promote accountability rather than isolation, and to resist the tendency to create modern versions of the same power structures that led to royal madness throughout history. The next time you encounter a leader who seems disconnected from reality, remember Elizabeth's lead makeup slowly poisoning her while she maintained an illusion of divine perfection. When you see organizations struggling with succession planning, think about the royal dynasties that collapsed because they couldn't solve the fundamental problem of transferring concentrated power. When you notice people becoming obsessed with their public image at the expense of actual competence, recall the countless monarchs who prioritized appearance over substance until their kingdoms crumbled around them. These lessons from royal history aren't just academic exercises. They're practical wisdom for navigating our complex modern world, where power dynamics, leadership challenges, and human nature remain fundamentally unchanged despite all our technological and social progress. I hope tonight's stories have entertained you, enlightened you, and maybe even inspired you to think differently about leadership, power, and the eternal human struggle to balance authority with wisdom, influence with responsibility, and ambition with empathy. Thank you for sharing this incredible journey through the strangest corners of royal history. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you next time for another expedition into the fascinating, bizarre, and endlessly instructive world of historical human behavior.